Прийшли окупанти до нас в Україну, форма новенька, воєнні машини, та трохи поплавився їх інвентар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російські танкісти сховались в кущі, щоб лаптем посьорбати довбані щі, та трохи у чах перегрівся навар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Приперли зі сходу до нас барани для восстановлення
великої страни.
Найкращий пастух баранячих отар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Їх доводи всяке озброєння, різне, потужні ракети, машини залізні, у нас на всі доводи є коментар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Вони захопити хотіли нас зразу, а ми зачаїли на орків образу з російських бандитів, робить примар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російська поліція справи заводить, там вбивцю рашистів ніяк не знаходить, хто винен, що в нашому полі глухар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Веде пропаганду кремлівський урод, слова пропаганди ковтає народ, тепер нове слово знає цар.
Байрактар.
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 Yes.
The Leaf Street Army sends its regards.
Русский военный корабль. Предлагаю сложить оружие и сдаться. Русский военный корабль, иди нахуй.
Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and tonight we're going to be covering the past 24 hours of the news of the war in Ukraine. And we've been getting some major news today from the area of Krenki, stating that Russian forces in this area appear to have been defeated in orderly fashion by Ukrainian forces, and it appears that an entire brand new brigade of the VDV is already beginning to sustain incredibly high losses within this direction. But before we get into that major breaking news tonight, I have two large announcements to make. Of course, tonight is Sunday, and that is the Sunday Fundraiser. And tonight's fundraiser is for an amazing nonprofit that has been working in Ukraine ever since pretty much the beginning of the war, years before the war even began. And that group is Razom for Ukraine. Razom for Ukraine is an amazing nonprofit organization that's been able to help save the lives of thousands of Ukrainians, not just thousands, but even far more than that over the course of not just this war, but the years before. The amount of support that they've been able to provide is amazing, and after a long time, we've almost decided that Revived Soldiers of Ukraine and Razom are pretty much the best fundraisers to make sure that the support makes it directly to Ukraine and helps out with the folks on the ground. Of course, I highly encourage that we support the Razom for Ukraine fundraiser tonight. As a collective, we have nearly made it to $1,000 already. We're around $888, and we have a $3,000 goal tonight. Many of y'all are very accustomed to our minimum fundraiser goals being somewhere around the $5,000 range. We've decided to actually change that for tonight because we know that it is the Christmas holidays, and because of that, many people are having to put, of course, support towards presents and things like that for their family members, and so we don't want to strain the Lee Spring Army all too much, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that we are able to provide enough support to a nonprofit like Razom where it actually can help them out and make sure that a Ukrainian is saved throughout the Christmas holidays. Also, another thing that y'all may notice is that Enforcer Matt is not here tonight. He is currently off doing something else and was not able to join us tonight for the stream. So sadly, there will be no poll segments. Live chat questions will have to be gathered straight out of the live chat pretty much when we are live. So always be making sure to throw in live chat questions in the live chat, because if you throw it in when I'm moving into a question segment, there is an incredibly high chance that that question will probably be answered on the spot. But of course, not only that, please make sure to support the fundraiser for Razom for Ukraine. We're already at $980, and BCBCR just threw in a $150 donation to the fundraiser, getting us to $1,144. And I gotta say, absolutely incredible. I'm gonna be also trying to call out top donors throughout the night if I can. If I miss you, I'm terribly sorry. And I also like to give a shout out to Snow White and Old Warrior, who both put in $100 donations during the 10-minute countdown. But moving on from that and into the major news of today, that's going to be taking us down into the direction of Krenki. Many of y'all may remember that around 2 weeks ago, the British Ministry of Defense was tipped off that a brand new brigade of the VDV, which is the Russian Airborne Forces, was being mobilized, and from that, we were able to gather several things. First, the equipment that they were going to be using was going to be somewhat older, considering that most of the more modern equipment has already been destroyed or is currently being used by the other 4 of the 5 VDV brigades. Another thing that we got, another thing that we were told is that apparently these forces would be far less trained than their other counterparts in the VDV amongst the other 4 out of the 5 brigades, and because of that, their losses were going to be increasingly high. The additional thing that we were also told, not really a big 2 things as far as the quality of the unit, but another big thing that we were told is that this VDV unit would not be joining the rest of them in the area of the Robotny front, or really the Zaporizhia front line. This one brigade was actually going to be specially put under the command of the Kherson front's command front, and would be put into that area to effect a defense. For the first time in the entirety of the Kherson battle during these past few months, we have finally seen that this VDV unit has arrived, as BMDs have started to appear near the frontline area. BMDs are something of a very light armored personnel carrier that the Russian armed forces try to use, and one of the most modern iterations is the BMD-4 seen here. The BMD series is an armored personnel carrier that was specifically designed for the use of Russian airborne forces for the most part. Of course, there are some BMDs that are present in other units of the Russian army, sometimes based off of availability, but nevertheless, for the most part, almost all BMDs that you will ever see in Russian service are a part of a VDV, or otherwise called an airborne force. We have seen that in the area of Krenki today, a Russian force, a Russian unit, attempted a push against the Ukrainians inside of Krenki, and it appears that they took massive losses in the form of 3 BMD-4s. When you see a picture of our first BMD destroyed right here, this one actually appears to be a BMD-2 instead, because it does not have the 100mm main gun and the 30mm coaxial. It appears to just have the 30mm 2A42 as its primary gun. Nevertheless, it was destroyed, and it is showing us that the Russian airborne must be in this area, because the losses indicate that it is most likely an airborne unit. We can also see in the next picture that there is a apparently destroyed little BMD right there. Pretty interesting to note. This one, from what we can tell, is most likely a BMD-4. And moving on into the next picture, we can also see a completely destroyed BMD-4. We can also see part of the turret gears over here, which allow the turret to rotate, but it appears that the hull of this was apparently burned all the way down. Moving on from that little bit of news and on into our next bit, we can also see the third BMD-4 that had a picture taken of it, completely destroyed. We can see the turret is off to the side of the remains of the APC, and it appears that the front two-thirds of the hull apparently was blown away. But of course, pretty nice to see that they were able to destroy that. And moving on from that, we also had a little bit of footage of the Russian losses near Krenki, more so pictures. We got to see once again that while it was mostly armored personnel carriers that appeared to have been destroyed today in the failed counterattack by this Russian VDV unit, they were accompanied with a larger armored support in the form of some main battle tanks. In particular, it appears that they were most likely being supported by T-72s, which is something a little common for an airborne force, at least the airborne forces that aren't will dropped into an area. Usually they do get some kind of armored support, and we can see those mostly T-72B3s, and also one T-72B, I believe. It says something about T-72B OBR 2020. I believe that's the 2020 modification of the T-72B3, but I'm not seeing any of these pictures that really indicate that that version of the main battle tank was there. They all appear to largely be T-72B3s. Nevertheless, going off of this past 24 hours of the counteroffensive near the direction of Krenki, we did get to see that the Russian VDV forces have met expectations in some regards and not met expectations in other regards. For one, it is actually a better equipped unit than we thought it would be. The 5th Brigade that was being raised is about 3,000 to 5,000 men strong, and that is an incredibly large group of manpower to try and raise and get equipment for. Seeing that they are being supported by T-72Bs as well as BMD-4s is actually higher in expectations than we were initially anticipating. We believe that they would most likely have somewhere around the ballpark of BMD-2s or maybe even older versions of the T-72, such as the T-72B, but from what we can tell, they're actually using almost entirely T-72B3s and BMD-4s with maybe a BMD-2 sprinkled in here and there. So, as far as the equipment goes, they're actually fairly equipped for what a modern Russian unit will look like. On the other hand, the significant amounts of losses that they took in 24 hours is truly showing that they are not doing well under any instance whatsoever based off of their training. Their training looks to have been most likely poor just based off the losses that they took in 24 hours. They lost roughly 3 main battle tanks and 3 BMD-4s. Pretty high losses. That would be about a third of an entire battalion's armored forces wiped out, along with around 10% of a battalion's armored personnel carriers destroyed in one day, which is pretty high attrition just for them to have made contact for the first time on that area of the front line. We're also going to be probably assuming that this VDV force will not be the most active and will probably be used as a reserve unit. While it is currently being used to try and bust through Krenki at the moment and push the Ukrainians back into the marsh, this is probably going to be a very rare instance where this Russian unit is used. For the most part, we're expecting that the reserve units, the ones that use Mosin Nagants as their service rifles sometimes, are probably going to be the ones that are fighting in the areas of Casualty, and Krenki for the most part, and the airborne brigade, the VDV, is going to be brought in whenever things get a little too serious for the Russians' mind, and they're probably going to be hoping that through that unit being introduced to the line, they'll either be able to stop a Ukrainian push or try and push them back out. That's probably not going to be a successful strategy, but that's most likely the one that the Russians are going to be trying to use, because the fact that the unit is using high-end equipment such as the BMD-4 and also the T-72B3, which not high-end by modern Western standards, but high-end by a Russian relative standard, it really does show this unit is probably not going to be a heavily active one, just because it has so much high-end equipment inside of it. They would rather send the rabble of their units in this area to fight near the areas of Casualty and Krenki instead of sending a more advanced unit like that. But moving on from that little bit of news, we did see something really interesting today. As many of y'all know, that the leader of Hungary at the moment is Viktor Orban, which has not really become a popular person among Ukrainian supporters, because Viktor Orban is not necessarily a pro-Ukraine supporter. It's more so the opposite. And it's caused a lot of ire and a lot of controversy inside of Hungary. And not only that, it has also caused a lot of disdain amongst Ukrainians. Today, during the inauguration ceremony of the president of Argentina, which we will not be getting into because that is largely a political affair, we did see, however, that the seating arrangement put Zelenskyy right beside Viktor Orban, and it turns out that Zelenskyy actually took the moment to speak to Viktor Orban, which was caught on film. It was an incredibly brief exchange, and we don't know what was actually said, but we did get to see Viktor Orban here on the right side of the screen and Zelenskyy here in the center, and so here's the clip. Also, I'm going to be muting it because I don't know if that audio is copyrighted or not, but we can see them discussing it. And we don't know what in the world they're talking about. But it's still very interesting to finally watch that Zelenskyy and Orban did end up finding each other in real life and apparently having a discussion. Many people have been wondering if that would ever happen, and it appears that by complete coincidence, not really planned out or anything, it ended up happening. So very interesting to see. I wonder if that's going to start changing Viktor Orban's mindset on Ukraine and what's been going on so far during the war. That is yet to be seen, because that happened just about 8 hours ago. But we will be watching over the next few weeks and seeing if the official stance of the office of the president of Hungary begins to change as time goes by. But speaking of other things, we did get to also see that within the Kursk Oblast, there was apparently, by the British Ministry of Defense, a large air attack that occurred on Ukraine over just a very short amount of time. This was published on the 10th of December, just today, brand new, fresh off the press, and it appears that the British Ministry of Defense has been able to get some more information about one of the larger drone attacks that just occurred over the past few days. Also, before I get on to that really quickly, we have already reached 1.9 thousand on the fundraiser. Absolutely blowing it away. And really quickly, I've also seen some people, while we're celebrating the amount raised on the fundraiser, some of y'all have actually been saying that you can't see the fundraiser anywhere for that matter. And let me pull my screen over here, because this is how I'm seeing the fundraiser total, and let me show y'all how I'm seeing it. If you're on a desktop, it should be down in the bottom right corner of the screen right here, and there's a big blue donate button. Sadly, some of our viewers who are outside the United States, most notably our Australian and New Zealand viewers, who there's a very large amount of, unfortunately cannot support fundraisers through the YouTube giving platform due to national laws within their nations. However, if you're a citizen of the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, any country that's a part of the European Union, Canada, as well as I believe India, South Korea, and several others, you actually can support the fundraiser through here. If you do not have that option and you are a viewer from Australia or New Zealand and you just want to be in the spirit of the night and help to support the fundraiser, you can actually go and support United 24 directly with this link right here. When you click this one, it actually takes you directly to United 24's website, where you can fundraise for Ukraine directly out of about the $500 million that they've raised. So they've done a lot better than the Lee Spring Army has at fundraising. We've only done 1.3 million. They've done about 500 million. But nevertheless, there's also a couple of other things that you can see down here as well about the fundraiser. One, you can actually get some info about Razom for Ukraine. And I actually put that link first, so that way y'all can go over here and see what kind of projects Razom for Ukraine has done. And not only that, how much they have been able to do inside of Ukraine. Because a lot of people are always wondering, who are these fundraisers? Why should we support them? And here's a link right here directly to their website, where they can actually tell you why it is worth supporting Razom for Ukraine and what they have done to help out in the war effort. We also have a little link down here as well that shows you how a YouTube giving fundraiser works, which is how we run our fundraisers on this channel exclusively. And it will tell you exactly how a channel could be eligible, how it runs, and everything else in between, just so that way the fundraiser is as transparent as it can possibly be. And I, of course, have to really quickly give a shout out to Don Edwards, M288, and Enforcer for President, who all threw in $50 donations to the fundraiser. And also, really quickly, let me grab, because I just saw it, Franz Jensen, who threw in a 101, Dad Good, who threw in 50 New Zealand, and also Renee Love, who threw in a 50, and let's see here, I want to make sure we don't miss anyone, DCC Prime, who threw in a 250, absolute legend, and BC Skyman, who threw in 100. I got to thank all of y'all for supporting this fundraiser massively, because every single one of y'all, both the support that's big and the support that's small, all add together to help us to get over the top and continue to support the Ukrainians in this war effort. And also, we've reached $2.3 thousand nearly, so we are just about $800 away from the fundraiser goal tonight. But let me collapse that real quick and take this back off screen, because I just wanted to tell y'all a little bit about the fundraiser, just in case some of y'all were having trouble finding, like many of y'all have been saying, the actual fundraiser down below. Hopefully it shows up. If it doesn't, it may be a YouTube glitch. But moving on from that, we did hear that the British Ministry of Defense was speaking about a large air attack that occurred over the skies of Ukraine somewhere around the 7th of December, and was able to get a lot more information about it. Huge shout out to LSA Sergeant Figman, who just threw in a 50, and also the anonymous viewer who threw in a 50 as well. But on the night of the 7th of December, which is, by the way, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Russian Air Force conducted a major wave of strikes toward Kyiv and central Ukraine using its heavy bomber fleet for the first time since the 21st of September 2023, indicating that this was a larger attack by the Russians. These aircraft, highly likely Tu-95 Bear H, likely launched at least 16 air-launched cruise missiles, ALCMs, from their typical operating area over the Caspian Sea. The the Caspian Sea being right over here, meaning that these Tu-95s most likely took off from the air bases near Saratov up here, and also Ingalls Air Base, flew down over the Caspian Sea, meaning that they flew over Astrakhan, fired off their missiles here, and then flew back to their bases. But moving on from that little quick analysis, let's see here, let me make sure I get to the right spot. The missiles were highly likely AS-23A Kodiaks, Russia's premier ALCM. Russia has almost certainly been stockpiling these missiles for use in the winter campaign that they've just entered. And a huge shout out to Naxus Fox, who just threw in a $300 donation to the fundraiser. Absolutely killing it. And I think we just got up to $2.65 thousand raised in 29 minutes. Nearly a record at this point. I think we're about to reach the fundraiser goal tonight already, but moving on from that, and a huge shout out, this was probably the start of a more concerned campaign by Russia aimed at degrading Ukraine's energy infrastructure. However, initial reports indicate the majority of these missiles were successfully intercepted by Ukrainian air defense. Despite at least one civilian reported killed, the damage currently appears to have been minimal. And we see that they mentioned a brand new kind of missile, an AS-23, that we haven't really heard used against Ukraine a lot. And let me make sure that I pull this up, so that way we can take a look at this missile and try and get a little bit more information about it. So it looks like we have the KH-101 land attack missile. And sadly, that website doesn't want to show me a picture of it. But I think we were able to find a picture of it right here. And here it is, the K-101, otherwise called the, let me make sure I get the name correct again, the AS-23A Kodiak. This is the missile that was being used, and we saw that 16 of them were fired in this attack by the Tu-95s flying over the northern Caspian Sea. Based off of this information, we could tell that Nicholas Condor just killed it with a $250 Canadian donation and got us up to 2.836 on the fundraiser. We are less than $200 away from reaching the fundraiser goal, and not only that, the Ukrainians had to deal with this missile overnight. And one thing that's very interesting to note is that while 16 of these being launched in a single attack does appear to be a fairly large number, especially for a more sophisticated missile by the Russians, it is much smaller of an attack than we used to see in the past. Most cruise missile attacks back in the day used to consist of numbers in the dozens, sometimes around 40 to 50 missiles being launched in one attack. We're not seeing that anymore. 16 is actually the largest attack that we've seen since about the mid part of this year, around June and July. And it appears that we're not going to be seeing any incredibly large air attacks, and these are so small that they're not able to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. 16 cruise missiles flying into an airspace that can support something around, I believe it was like 8 cruise missiles being launched along with 76 drones, and being able to shoot down all incoming cruise missiles and all drones except for one. That is showing us that these missiles would not make it through. It was a Hail Mary attempt by the Russian Air Force to try and knock out Ukrainian energy infrastructure for the most part, and it appears to have completely failed. But giving us some new information about the kinds of strategies and doctrines that the Russian Air Force is attempting to use to knock out Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Considering that this was pretty much an unmitigated failure, I'm sure they're going to be going back to the drawing board and trying to figure out what to do next to try and knock out Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But moving on from that little bit of news inside of the Belgorod and Kursk region, we're now going to be moving down into our location unknowns, because we have some very interesting ones tonight, especially incredibly interesting. But moving into our first one, we did get to see that the Ukrainians are using what was called a shotgun drone. We haven't seen anything like this before, so I'm going to show you all the clip, and we're going to look at it together. We can see the Russians wandering through the fields, and oh my lord, we just hit goal! Hey! We just hit $3,000, and not only that, raced ahead and ended up hitting $3,234,000. I think we're going to be getting a little bit even higher than that, but we have reached the goal for tonight. A huge shout out to everyone in the Leaf Spring Army who was able to make that possible. Everyone who's been hitting the like button, everyone who's been supporting the fundraiser, everyone who's been doing everything possible. I got to thank every single one of y'all, because once again, the Leaf Spring Army didn't fail to miss its goal and is continuing to support Ukraine with all of its effort and all of its might. Absolutely incredible, and I got to thank all of y'all so much once again for being here tonight. Like Hal Rose throwing in 100, and also let me make sure to call out a couple of y'all. Old Warrior threw in another $154 donation. Naxus Fox threw in another $250 Canadian. And let's see, an anonymous viewer threw in a 50. And we have Nicholas Condor, who did throw in a $250 as well. But I got to thank all of y'all so much once again, because y'all have blown through another fundraiser goal, and we've made it up to $3,354 raised. Absolutely incredible. Usually, I would tell y'all that the fundraiser is not over. But tonight, since we have reached the goal, it could be over for you if you want it to be. I want everyone to remember that it is Christmas time, and we do know that many of y'all have to do a lot of Christmas shopping, and that usually becomes quite expensive. And so I always want to make sure that we take care of the Leaf Spring Army and also take care of Ukraine at the same time. So if you're feeling a little bit under the strain of Christmas around this time of year, that's why we've started to reduce the fundraiser goals just by a little bit, so that way we can make sure that folks who may have to go do some Christmas shopping can still do it and not feel obligated to, pour everything out for Ukraine as well. But of course, we'll be getting back to our higher $5,000 goals after Christmas. But moving on back into this clip, we can see the Russians walking into what appears to be a field of destroyed tanks, and then all of a sudden, we see a drone fly right over them, and it explodes. And from what we are told, it's some kind of an air burst shotgun variant of a drone. So I'm supposing that there's some kind of a crude shotgun barrel below it firing off some sort of a 12 gauge. We can see two of the Russian soldiers in that four-man group fall over. The others try and figure out what to do for a little bit. And we see one of the Russians crawling away. And that's the end of the clip, but showing a brand new kind of drone being used by the Ukrainians and giving us a new insight to some of the strategies that they're trying to use to make the drones possibly reusable, and not only that, also as devastating. The fact that they're using some kind of an airburst shotgun is very interesting, very innovative from the drone warfare side of things. It's one of the first times that we've heard of anything similar to a rifle or really a projectile being used on a drone that is fired from the drone itself. This kind of strategy may prove to be very successful, especially going into the future, and I'll show y'all why when we get down to the Zaporizhia front and the Surovikin line that the Russians still hold, at least in some areas. Moving on from that and into our next clip, we also got to see a huge montage of recently captured Russian prisoners of war. There was a lot of them. This is from what we've been told over about the past 2 weeks, and a lot of these are clips that we have never seen before, but giving us a glimpse into the mass of Russian soldiers that have ended up surrendering just over the past few weeks of fighting.
Oh yeah!
And we're gonna have to mute that for copyright reasons, but oh yeah, baby! And we can see the truck driving off. We can see another Russian prisoner taken here. The guy looks fairly old. He looks like he's in his mid to late 50s. We can now see them taking some Russian prisoners here in the back. We can see some Russian prisoners somewhere in a village, apparently just recently surrendering. We see these Russians here drinking some kind of water. It appears that their hands and legs are bound, so that way they can't try and escape. Man, they're sipping that water like it's something nice. They got their hands cupped around it. They're like, oh, это блядь. We see them continuing to sip the water. This video is incredibly long. Some people on YouTube pay to watch this kind of stuff. Just, someone drinking water and sipping it very loudly in front of a video. But sadly, these Russians are not getting paid. By anyone, actually. If they're not getting paid by the Ukrainians, they're not getting paid by the Russians either. We're going to skip forward a little. Actually, this video ends literally just in the next few seconds. But we now see another captured Russian prisoner. His face has been blurred out along with another. But it appears that both of them have been caught very recently. We can tell because they're wearing heavy winter jackets. Some of these are not issued to Russian forces. Sometimes you'll see that they do not wear heavy winter jackets. But the fact that these guys are tells us, one, they're lucky, and two, that this is during the winter month of December. And I see a lot of y'all in the live chat calling for a general order. And you know what? I'll get behind it. I'll get behind it tonight. It is time for a general order as Michael Stackpole starts us off with a $100 donation, absolutely starting it off strong. Now let me make sure to throw in my 20 so that way I can make sure to lead from the front because you always want to lead by example. But if you are a member of the Leaf Spring Army and you do have $5 to give to the fundraiser, throw it in right now. I'm going to be throwing in 20. But make sure to support the fundraiser tonight. We have a general order being called order. General order number 29, I think it is. But make sure to blow this fundraiser up and let's send it to space. And so I've already thrown in my 20, and I hope the rest of the Leaf Spring Army joins me in making sure that we send this thing on up into the moon. And so with that, I'm going to be typing in general order into the chat and making sure that this thing flies. And we see this Russian soldier right here, most likely being interrogated after he was captured. And we're going to be skipping this little clip. But we can also see the next clip showing us another Russian soldier that had also been captured. And here comes the general order. It is blowing up right now, and I'm seeing a lot of people throwing in their $5 donation. And I got to thank all of y'all so much. Sadly, we can't ever call out donations that are below $50 because there is just so many of them. But I want y'all to know that as a bulk group, y'all do as much fundraising as the massive donors do. And that is absolutely incredible to think. The small donors have as much of a contribution as the big donors as well. And I want y'all to know that y'all are greatly appreciated. And I thank every single one of y'all for being members of the Leaf Spring Army and making sure that our goal of supporting Ukraine continues to stay alive. And also, huge shout out to Peter, I believe it was, who threw in a £50 donation to the fundraiser, and everyone who's throwing in support during the general order. And we see another Russian soldier that was captured. He's wearing a ratnik camo pattern, but it appears to have been soaked either by rain or by water, just sitting on the ground in like a puddle or something. But the guy is soaking wet in the middle of winter, and you know that's gotta suck. We see the guy continuing to be interrogated. Oh, we got audio. Sweet.
Ничего не осталось. 300, да, мало. Кто-то 300 выдачи. У нас первый раз, вот второй раз сейчас кинули. Первый раз кинули, нас под мины попали. Ну, половина точно это. Кто-то 200, кто-то 300. Сейчас вот пораскидали по группам. Там кто-то, кого-то я знаю с роты, кого-то нет. Ну, так вот. Еще даже толком со всеми познакомиться не успел. Понятно. Понятно.
I can see them wrapping up that little interrogation, and the video ends, but giving us a good look at the large number of Russian soldiers that have been taken prisoner over just about the past week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, and also indicating to us that some Russian soldiers are heavily demoralized to the point that they're no longer willing to fight, much like these soldiers were. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to Hal Rose, who just threw in a $333, iconic number by Hal Rose, donation to the fundraiser. Probably, from what I can think, I think that is the largest one of the night so far, if I'm recalling them all correctly. And I gotta thank Hal Rose for being a legend, not only on the channel, but also in the fundraisers as well, and helping this fundraiser get up to $4.7 thousand raised. Nearly $5,000, and we only had a $3,000 goal. Absolutely incredible. And speaking of incredible, the Russian losses also got about as high as the fundraiser did today as well. So moving on to the casualty report, we got to see that 3 Bobcat skid steers were destroyed, 700 troops were wiped out, along with 10 armored personnel carriers, 25 supply trucks, 4 main battle tanks, 6 artillery systems, and 1 cruise missile. All in all, some very good numbers. Not the incredibly high numbers that we have been seeing over about the past few weeks, but still showing that the Ukrainians are mounting a very effective defense and continuing to make sure to keep their nation clear of Russians, at least the areas that have not been overtaken by the Russians at this point. And hopefully, through these continued losses, they will be able to ensure that the Russians will not be able to continue on fighting inside of Ukraine, and their counteroffensives will end up proving being successful, going up against heavily attrited Russian forces. But it is very good to see these kinds of numbers. And speaking of numbers, I have to say this really quickly. I'm about to start pulling questions straight out of the live chat here in a moment. If you have a question about the war that you would like to have answered while I'm transitioning, make sure to throw it in while you're hearing this right now. I'm going to be grabbing about 3 of them and answering them during this moment, and that is going to serve as our transition into the next news segment. But ask any question you would like about the war, about what's been going on. Just make sure not to include anything about domestic politics in your home country. We don't really address that kind of stuff on this channel because we're mostly entirely focused on supporting Ukraine, and we're not really into things that would end up dividing Ukrainian supporters on what is kind of, small fry stuff. But moving on from the casualty report and on into the area of the Northern Front, it is now time for us to try and start grabbing some questions from the live chat. And Mad Machine threw in a very interesting one, and this actually talks about the very first part of our news in the area around Krenki, as the VDV has now been introduced there. Mad Machine just asked, does the Dnipro River marsh area freeze in the winter? If so, could Ukraine use it as an ice bridge to send over armor across to hit the orcs in the rear? And that's a very interesting question, Mad Machine, and it's something that in some parts of the world ends up being true. Some rivers do end up freezing, and a lot of them are somewhat smaller. Rivers like the Dnipro, however, with that terrible voice crack, sorry about that, but rivers like the Dnipro River actually have a very difficult time freezing, mostly due to the speed at which the water moves, and also the sheer volume of water. Like, for example, before the Novakakovka Dam was blown up, the sheer volume of water ensures that it doesn't ever really freeze over. Yes, the temperature does get low enough throughout the entirety of the length of the Dnipro River that you could, in fact, end up freezing this thing over. If it was not moving water. But the problem is that it's such a large body of water for the most part, and also it's such a fast-moving body of water. I believe the normal current in the Dnipro River is around 4 to 5 miles per hour, which is a pretty decent speed. The water is never still enough at most times to be able to freeze over, meaning that throughout all times of the year, the Dnipro River does prove to be a pretty considerable obstacle to really any attackers or defenders that are having to deal with the river. And so, for the most part, while some places like the Konka River right here may end up freezing over because they're small, the currents are probably incredibly slow in this area, and not only that, it's not a large amount of water to have to freeze over, the larger Dnipro River itself will probably never end up being frozen over. We saw that was certainly the case last year, as the Russians had to end up using the pontoon bridge that they built directly along the Antonovsky Bridge in the middle of December, well, actually it was right at the very end of November, to cross the river, and it was so cold then that the first snowfalls were being reported in northern Ukraine. So going off of that, sadly, they would not be able to pull armor across the river, and also, if it did freeze over, the amount of ice you would need to support the weight of a main battle tank would be incredibly ludicrous. A main battle tank can weigh anywhere in between about 33 to 60 tons. Usually Soviet-era main battle tanks were within the ballpark of 30 to maybe the low 40s in tons. Western main battle tanks like the Leopard 2 get on up towards being around 60 tons apiece. They're incredibly heavy, very heavy, and the amount of thickness of ice that you would need for a tank to be able to cross a river would have to be multiple feet thick, to the point that you would never really see that kind of freezing on the Dnipro River, even if it froze over at all. The ice would just be too thin. If they want to get armor across, they're most likely going to have to take a pontoon bridge or something similar, build it across the river, also build up some kind of a small roadway or a hard-packed surface in the marsh for the tanks to be able to get across and then support the Ukrainian infantry. And so for now, during these winter months, we're still probably going to see that the ground situation for Ukrainian forces on the left bank of the Dnipro are probably going to be very similar to what they were during the summer. And so, I hope that does answer that question incredibly well, Mad Machine. That was a very good one, and I hope that the answer was what you were looking for in terms of the depth and analysis that we have, and also the precedents that we have laid out from the war earlier. Let's see here. And, Tom Exman actually asked a very interesting question. He said, okay, Andrew, why do you think the tank loss is so low lately? Maybe weather? Maybe weather. It may also be that the Russians are not dedicating a very large number of tanks to the front lines. We do understand that tanks are becoming a very rare and precious commodity for most Russian frontline units. Tanks like the T-72B3 and the T-80BVM are seldom seen at this point, and Krenki today, seeing 2 of them lost near Krenki, was actually something pretty surprising for the most part, because we don't really see that happening a lot anymore. Going off of that, knowing that tanks are becoming more and more scarce, it may actually be a directive from the Russian Ministry of Defense itself that tanks need to be spared, and infantry will move up onto the lines maybe without tank support at all. So that way they can try and preserve their tanks for a day where it's a doomsday scenario and they must be brought up to the front lines to try and stop a Ukrainian breakthrough. Or if the infantry has almost made a breakthrough and it looks like they're about to be thwarted, they'll bring up the tanks and try and support them so that way the breakthrough can occur. So I think that the tank losses may be a little bit because of the weather, but mostly because they are starting to run out of high-end tanks to such a heavy degree that it may no longer be possible to expend tanks at the rate they have over the past 2 years or so. And so with that, I hope that does address that well, and thank you so much, Tom Exman, for asking a really good question. Not only that, being a legend on this channel, and we also see that Sven R. Cardell, very interesting name, and I haven't seen your name in the live chat often. He asked, what will it take before Putin uses his nuclear weapons? And this is a question that we actually had answered a lot back in the past, but this question has kind of fallen to the wayside because the inevitability of nuclear war has started to subside over time. But the question still remains, what is the roof or the ceiling that would push Putin to using nuclear weapons? What would have to happen for Russia to go to those lengths in that kind of an extreme? Well, first off, to tell you, I do not think that nuclear weapons will ever be used inside of Ukraine. The war has been going on for around 1 year and 10 months approximately, and it's about to be going on into being 2 years long. The Russians have been beaten quite significantly in multiple different campaigns. For example, the northern campaign, they were beat within about a month and a half. We also saw that further south in the area around Kharkiv, we also saw that the Russians were defeated around the later part of 2022, around the autumn, and they were pushed all the way back behind Kupiansk, which was also a very serious defeat for Russian forces in the area, depriving them of the ability to try and conduct an offensive and capture the second largest city in Ukraine behind Kyiv. We also saw that the Ukrainians were able to conduct a very successful offensive in the Kherson area as well, with a major breakthrough occurring down the Dachany roadway and making its way almost all the way down to Malove and Novokary. This push threatened the Russian rear for most of the units that were further north near the area of Petropavlivka and ended up forcing the Russians into a complete retreat across the river, blowing up their exits as they went, and hoping that the Ukrainians would not ever be able to cross forward for the remainder of the war. All of those offensives were wildly successful, but the real problem here that we see that still goes on to this day is that we can't really tell if they would be able to really do anything like that again. And we don't think they will. And that shows that if the Russians really wanted to make a breakthrough, they wanted to do something serious, that would probably be a moment to use nuclear weapons, as like in a situation right now. But they're not. Russian nuclear doctrine is largely defensive, and their nuclear doctrine revolves around using nuclear weapons in the defense of their state. It's very hard for them to justify the defense of their state in something like the offensive at Avdiivka or the war in Ukraine for the most part, and so we see that they don't use nuclear weapons. For the Russians to use nuclear weapons on anything that would revolve around the Ukraine war situation, you would see that the Russians would have to get into a war with NATO. The war would somehow have to expand outside of Ukraine and include the Western world. If it did, we would most likely expect that the Kaliningrad Oblast would be either held or pushed back heavily towards the city of Kaliningrad, and the Suwalki Gap would never be closed. U.S. and European forces would probably be able to swiftly move forward across the field from the area of Narva and towards St. Petersburg, most likely besieging it in under a month or 2 months, and we would also see that there would be spearheads moving from multiple directions, most likely towards Minsk and Moscow, as Belarus would be a de facto member of this hypothetical war. Based off of this situation and the fact that the Russian army is incredibly underprepared, underperforming, and undertrained, we would most likely see that this would be a decisive Western victory against the Russian Federation and may actually compromise the security of their state, which is the key factor in their defensive doctrine. In that kind of a situation, it would most likely be inevitable that the Russians would start to use tactical nuclear weapons on advancing forces such as the U.S. military or other European forces, largely NATO forces. We would probably see that in response, the United States will revive its Cold War era doctrine of also using tactical nuclear weapons against smaller elements of Russian forces on the field, such as an army corps in size. That would eventually turn into the situation becoming so severe that an intercontinental ballistic exchange would occur in between the Russian Federation, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and I'm trying to think, there I believe is another... Nope, those are all the nuclear powers in the NATO alliance, but that would most likely occur probably several months after that war would have begun. But that is the way that a nuclear exchange would actually happen. It would take a lot of things to go wrong at this point for a nuclear war to really occur. And also, I have to tell you this, it's not going to be anything instantaneous. You'll actually see the writing on the wall before it happens. Military doctrine doesn't revolve around if the United States declared war on Russia, Russia nukes us immediately. And the United States doesn't revolve around the idea that if the Russians went to war with us, we'll nuke them immediately. It doesn't actually. We actually will go into a conventional war with the Russian Federation if it was to begin. And NATO doctrine also allows for that as well. Conventional war is inevitable with a war with Russia. The thing is, however, is that once U.S. forces, or really NATO forces for that matter, begin to have successful breakthroughs against Russian forces, Russian doctrine actually requires the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and we also require the exact same in NATO doctrines like the US Cold War era Air Force doctrines, where if a major breakthrough happens on the ground, we are to nuke the rapidly advancing Russian forces, or back during the day, they were the rapidly advancing Soviet forces. That's something required in the doctrine. And what's even more interesting about this is that this is actually handicapped Russian forces to this day, especially in the Russian Air Force. Their requirements for precision bombing with unguided dumb bombs is incredibly low, and as a matter of fact, the accuracy rate of Russian Air Force pilots dropping dumb bombs is incredibly low. They very rarely ever hit their targets, and the reason why is that the Russian Air Force has very minimal requirements for unguided bomb accuracy. That's because, and also, Tom Exman, you're right, it's over $5,000! Let's go! And I gotta say, absolutely incredible. Somehow, we don't even have a $5,000 goal tonight. We hit $5,000. Truly amazing. And thank you for letting me know, Tom Exman. And thank you to everyone who supported the fundraiser and gotten this thing over 5K. If you like that, put an LSA in the chat. Put it in the chat. But getting back to what we were talking about with the Russian Air Force and how nuclear weapons work, the Russian Air Force does not actually have any stringent requirements on accuracy for unguided dumb bombs like the Fab 500. And let me see if I can pull up a picture of an Su-27 Fab 500. And let me go to images. And let's see here. Can't get any real pictures of an Su-27 carrying the Fab 500 from what I can tell. But, well, actually, no, we can. We can get this Su-34 right here. This is an Su-34 tactical bomber, which has been used by the Russians a little bit in Ukraine. This guy in this plane is probably not going to be all that accurate with these dumb bombs because the Russian Air Force doesn't require them to be accurate, and here's why. They plan on these guys probably dropping nuclear bombs before they ever even drop a large amount of unguided dumb bombs. That's just how Russian doctrine works. And so if, say, the 3rd Armored Division of the U.S. Army conducted a breakthrough at Narva and started racing towards St. Petersburg, you would probably see an Su-34 equipped with a tactical nuclear bomb dropping on the highway in between Narva and St. Petersburg, wiping out a decent amount of the 3rd Armored Division in that nuclear attack. That would start to happen all over the place on the front lines, and that would most likely occur for days, if not weeks, where both sides just obliterate the other's armed forces with nuclear weapons. Then, once both sides' armed forces had been almost so thoroughly decimated by these tactical nuclear strikes, we would probably see that an intercontinental ballistic exchange would occur, and that is the Armageddon situation that many of y'all would know from popular media. But I hope that does address how a nuclear war would occur under the current circumstances, because that looks to be the most likely option. Of course, I'm not entirely right. There is still room for me to be wrong in that kind of a scenario. Anything could happen. Hell, it could just be like the movie show, where an intercontinental ballistic exchange happens immediately. Sometimes that almost did happen in the past, usually because of a misunderstanding. But with that, I hope that does address that final question from this segment incredibly well. And I also got to thank yours Sparky for the $50 donation to the fundraiser. And I also have to thank everyone else who threw in donations to the fundraiser while I was going through the question segment. I saw one or two of them that were over $50. Sadly, I wasn't able to see a lot of them, but I do want to give you all massive shout outs and massive thanks for always keeping the Ukrainians in mind and helping to support them in this war against the Russian invasion. And so with that, we're now going to be moving out of this question segment and back into the front lines of Ukraine, and specifically around the area of Kuzymivka. Here we got to see that the 80th Separate Brigade was conducting some forest fighting against Russian forces. We can see them advancing. We see them firing. We can see a soldier that appears to have surrendered. He's laying pretty low and pretty still. Probably a smart move on his end.
Є хто ж живий, іди сюди, сука! Руки підняв, зброю кинув, йдеш сюди! Руки підняв, йдеш
We hear the
сюди!
Ukrainian soldier yelling. Most likely trying to encourage the rest of the Russians to surrender.
Руки підняв, йдеш сюди!
We now see him advancing, and it appears that this guy actually is using a captured AK-12.
Мені треба тут. Забирай нього, забирай!
We see them checking out the Russians that are laying down on the ground. And Alabama occasion, I know, it's like, why in the world are they sleeping in the middle of a war? I mean, the guy just got captured. Oh my god, is that a Dragunov? That's a Dragunov. Okay, so apparently one of the people who surrendered and is now napping, apparently had an SVD Dragunov. Very interesting. We rarely ever see these, although Russian infantry doctrine requires that there be a designated marksman using an SVD Dragunov or some other kind of a modern Russian sniper in every single squad, nearly. It's actually a very interesting doctrine because Western forces do not have a very high concentration of designated marksmen, much like Russian doctrine requires. But this is one of the first times I've ever seen an SVD being captured, and this war's been going on for a year and 10 months. And Robert, no, they're not. But that's the end of the clip and showing us some successful forest fighting going on in the area of Kuzmivka, down the highway, the P60, well, actually the P07 highway towards Svatove. But moving on to our next clip, we also got to see a kamikaze drone hitting Russian forces in another area of the front line. And we can see the drone coming on down on an incredibly large concentration of Russian forces. This may be several platoons worth, maybe 2 platoons of Russian infantry that are in an assembly area near the line that have been caught off guard. And it appears that they really were caught off guard. But that's the end of the clip. Pretty interesting to see. And also, I gotta say, very effective hit. We also geolocated that to the exact area. It was somewhere around right here in this field. Very nice to see, and a very successful hit. Once again, showing that Ukrainian drone forces are wildly successful at attriting Russian forces, especially in the northeastern area where the battle is a lot more sparse, at least in direct contact fights like we saw near Kuzmivka. Also, I just saw someone, I gotta say this real quick, someone just said that the Romanian version of the SVD is terrible. And from what I've heard, it's a little iffy. Some people say it's terrible, some people say it's not. But the specific rifle that this guy is talking about, and this guy, why in the world did I call you this guy? You're a channel legend. Let me make sure I go back up and make sure that it's the right person. John Vonzo, who has been here forever. Let me go type in the Romania PSL. Let me go show you a picture of this. So this is what everyone calls the SVD at home. It looks a lot like the SVD. I'm sure many of y'all would mistake it for the SVD, and I usually did as well back in the day until I started to learn a lot about SVD variant rifles. This, however, is a bit of a cheap knockoff, and from what I've heard, there's been mixed results. Some people say that the accuracy is pretty good, but some people also say that it has a heat issue, where if the rifle starts to heat up, the grouping, or the minute of angle, starts to rapidly increase from somewhere, I believe, at several hundred yards, around 2 inches minute of angle, to after around an entire magazine being fired from the PSL, the minute of angle can be anywhere around 5.3 inches to maybe even 8 inches minute of angle, which is actually very high, even for a designated marksman rifle like this. I don't know anything about it, really. I've got to be honest with you. I can tell you all about the minute of angle, the heat warping problem, all that kind of stuff, but I don't really know much about this rifle rather than those small things. We have been thinking and entertaining the idea of maybe getting one of these as a loaner gun. We do know of people who have Romanian PSLs, and we might be able to try and review this thing on our channel once we get into the gun review videos, but we will have to wait and see if that is a possibility because, you know, of course, who knows what the future may hold. But anyways, moving on from that little bit of news and that side note, just talking about the PSL versus the Dragunov and all of that, we're now moving on to our next little clip where we got to see a Russian MLRS attack occur. And we can see the Russians blanketing an entire village with MLRS fire in the area. And Angry Penguin said, parent against the SVD. I wish. SVDs run around $10,000 to $12,000. They are incredibly expensive and very rare in U.S. markets. It would probably be very hard to find someone who even was able to give that to us as a loaner rifle. But I would love to do that one day, is try and verse the SVD to the PSL, and maybe even other SVD variants as well, like the Norinco SVD from China, and also the Yugoslavian M70 variant of the SVD, or not really a variant of the SVD, but it was built to pretty much be a competitor to the SVD within Yugoslavia. But we can see the MLRS barrage continuing. It appears that several grads were most likely used to conduct this barrage, probably around 12 to 15 miles away, and we can see that the video was filmed by the Russians. It appears that it may have even been a naval infantry brigade, because we can see the flag of the Russian Navy in the background, and we can also see a guards division emblem up here. This is actually very confusing, but nevertheless, we're going to be moving on from that little clip of that MLRS attack. Who knows if it was successful or not. Looks like it was pretty inaccurate, like most MLRS attacks are, but moving on from that, we're now getting on down into the Bakhmut area, and we have seen that there has not been a large amount of frontline changes in this area over the past 24 hours, and let me show you what we have seen. Over about the past 24 hours, we've actually seen that the Russians have advanced in small form in two areas, near Yahidne and also near Bakhmut. It appears that they are able to advance maybe several hundred meters or so. It may indicate that the Ukrainian force in this area may have been worn out and had to fall back due to some kind of a heavy assault, but it's still not really that much of major movement. Moving on into the videos that we got from the area, we did get to see that a camera was recording the sounds of incoming drone attacks on a position. We don't really know whose position this was, whether it be Ukrainian or Russian, but here's the clip. We hear the drone flying in. We hear the sound of the drone whining in and hitting and exploding. We hear another drone flying around. It appears that they're about to get hit a second time, whoever's forces these are. We heard the sounds of distant rifle fire, possibly indicating of the assault miles away. And we hear the drone flying in and hitting a second time. We hear a third drone coming in. And it sounds as though whoever side is using this doesn't go in initially on the first attack. It appears that they give a pass over the trench, and then they finally conduct the attack, giving a moment to respond, but we're not hearing any rifles responding to these incoming drones, possibly suggesting that all of the soldiers have gone into dugouts and are trying to wait out the drone attack. It's now gone completely silent. Very weird, especially considering all the drone attacks that just occurred. But that gives us a little bit of insight just to the raw, visceral sounds that are made during a drone attack. It sounds a lot like a mosquito, and 3 of them hitting your trench at the same time, but probably the deadliest mosquito-sounding thing that exists in the entire world. We're now going to be moving on from that little bit of news and further down the line and into the direction of Klishkivka. We got 2 clips from this area today, and one of them did show the 93rd blasting away more Russian forces right near the outskirts of Klishkivka, and so here's the clip. We're going to be muting that, but we can see it's Moto Live, baby! And we can see what appears to be possibly Russian forces here in this field laying low. It appears that the 93rd has called in some mortar fire onto this column of Russian forces and are trying to pepper them as they continue to stay low in the fields. We now clearly see the outlines of Russian infantrymen right here in this ditch and right above the ditch as well. And it appears that they've now dialed in the artillery to land right on top of them. We see them continuing to look down, and I can't really tell y'all right now because I can't see if those are impacts or Russian soldiers, but if those are Russian soldiers, there's an incredibly large amount of them that were in this field. The Fighting 93rd has practically been in the area around the Bakhmut battlefield for an incredibly long time. They haven't really moved a lot in this war, maybe about 70 miles south since the beginning of the fighting. The 93rd Brigade was initially fighting in the area around Kharkiv at the very beginning of the war in 2022, or more so the beginning of the invasion. After the Izium counteroffensive, which the 93rd Brigade was the one to spearhead that offensive and be the first one to break through the Russian lines, they then stayed around the Kupiansk-Veslovy area for around a month and a half, and then were moved further south to Bakhmut during the Wagner offensive on that city, and have been in the Bakhmut battlefield area ever since the later part of 2022, sometime around October or November. They are an incredibly famous unit, probably one of the heaviest fighting and most steadfast units in the Ukrainian armed forces since the start of the war, going up against Russia's elites time and time again, and constantly showing that they meet the test, and not only that, but they exceed it with flying colors. We're now going to be moving on from that clip showing the 93rd Brigade using its artillery and drones to try and knock out Russian infantry columns, and we're now going to be moving into our next clip where we got to see what an area near the front lines looked like, specifically around the area of Kurtimivka. And so, here's the clip. And also, by the way, really quickly, this is a video from the channel, The Flashback. Really cool guy. We've promoted him on the channel before, and he's a Ukrainian soldier that has been fighting on the front lines of Ukraine. I wanted to show his clip because it was a very interesting one from the Seversk-Bakhmut region. We, of course, geolocated it to this area around Kurtimivka, but due to OPSEC reasons, I will tell you all that that marker is not exactly accurate. This is most likely a few miles away, either north or south. But here's the clip. When you see the Ukrainians advancing with some BTR APCs towards the front, and we now see that the infantry have dismounted. We hear the sounds of distant fighting. We can also see some small amounts of trash littering the area. We can see the soldiers now firing their AKs towards the other tree line about 50 yards away.
Бой пошел, бой.
And also, Von Delta, thank you so much for the offer. I have not actually seen a Hakim in real life. And I also have not really fired a lot of Mosin guns. I had one when I turned 18. I bought it for like $300 back then, which looking back was a steal. Because nowadays I think the Mosins are like $500 to $700 a piece, even in somewhat mint, well not mint, but somewhat poorer condition. But I would be interested. If we could find a way to get those to Alabama so that way we can review them here, I would be more than happy to. We see them continuing to fire. Interestingly enough, they're not using their PKM machine gun that's right here to lay down fire. Instead, they're using their AKs. We can also see that they have placed some F1 grenades right by the PKP machine gun, just in case the things get a little too hairy. We now see them reloading their magazines. It appears that they're using 7.6 ammo, a very common ammo in former Soviet countries. It's an armor-piercing variant, and is also corrosive as well, so you have to extensively clean your rifle after using corrosive ammo to ensure the longevity of the rifling in the barrel. Just a small little tidbit, but, you know, getting you a little bit of an idea of what life would be like for an infantryman in Ukraine. And now we can see them having a little bit of food. Looks like they got some bread and some ham. Best combination. All you need is mayonnaise, and you've got the whole thing complete. But that's the end of that clip, showing a little bit of the ongoing action and fighting in that area. Also indicating to us that the Ukrainians are continuing to try and hold an effective defensive of the area and continue to inflict some pretty decent casualties. We're now going to be moving on from that area and a little bit further down and into the direction of Avdiivka. Avdiivka was the battlefield that we got the most information from in video and picture evidence today, and is indicating that there was a heavy amount of action that occurred in between Ukrainian and Russian forces there. Some of this, however, is a little bit rare. Usually, I do not include videos on this stream that would be graphic in nature. For YouTube reasons, we will not be able to show them on stream either. But we do have them on the map. They're labeled not for stream, as you can see right there, and also right there. I will not be able to show y'all those clips. I will tell y'all what they show, and if y'all would like to see what's inside of those clips, I will show you where to go. If you're watching this on the desktop, this will be applicable to you. If you're watching on a phone or a tablet, or a TV, unfortunately, I cannot really tell you how to get to the description below the video. But all you have to do is go down here, click more if you're on the desktop, scroll down a little bit further, and you will get to see all of our links. You'll want to click on this one, because this is the current day's map of the war in Ukraine, and it will take you directly to the map that you're seeing me use on stream right now, and you'll be able to click on any link you want. You'll particularly be looking for these two links near the village of Krasnoarivka, near Avdiivka. These videos in particular I cannot show on stream because they are very graphic in nature, but I believe that it's sometimes important to make sure that y'all have access to these kinds of clips and get to see what's really going on. I always show y'all the Ukrainians winning, and in these videos the Ukrainians are certainly winning, no doubt about it. But there are a lot of people always have questions, how are they winning? What does the war really look like beyond what is allowable to see on YouTube? And these videos will show you. In this clip right here near Krasnoarivka, we did see that the Magura took out a sniper. From what I understand, it wasn't exactly a sniper like we think of in the Western sense, where it's some crazy guy who sits in his own piss for like a few days, fires a shot that's about a mile away, and then he gets up and runs off after he fires that shot. Russian marksmen, like we were talking about earlier with the SVD Dragunov, are actually at the squad level, and aren't as highly trained, as highly accurate, and as far-hitting as their Western counterparts, but they are much more numerous in number. The SVD Dragunov is usually the preferred weapon of choice, although that started to change in modern days, and some units have begun to use the SV98. But let me go and get y'all a picture of the Dragunov sniper. I'm sure many of y'all know it. It is a legend of warfare. It is also the sniper rifle of the bad guys in every single movie. This is the SVD. This is the gun that a lot of Russian designated marksmen in each squad would use. There is one designated marksman per squad, and these guys are kind of decent at what they do. They're able to hit out to a range of about 850 meters, which for the most part is a very far distance for an infantry squad to be able to reach, and really does give a lot of, I guess you could say, heads up or warning time to the Russian infantry before the enemy infantry are able to close in to about 400 to 500 yards range, which is usually where the actual accurate rifle, well, the actual gunfight begins in between the two squads. The SVDs aren't going to be hitting mile-long shots. That is something that we actually know. These things are not a M110 or anything crazy like that. Or an M114, I believe, is another kind of sniper, or an M82 Barrett. They're not these kinds of rifles. These are just for things that are about 900, maybe 1,000 yards away, really pushing it. Maybe 1,200, really, but they're not going to be hitting far. This is the kind of marksman that we saw in the video, and I can't show it to y'all. I'm very sorry about that, but I'm trying to give y'all as much detail and information as I can. The marksman was sitting in a crater, covered with a thermal blanket, and he was trying to line up a shot, most likely. The drone dropped a bomblet right into his dugout or his crater, whatever you'd like to call it, and it ended up blasting the guy right in the face, and that's why we can't show it, because he actually flips over and looks upwards into the sky, and you actually get to see a little bit of how badly the drone bomb got him. But he was an SVD marksman for a squad that was out there in that area, and it appears that he was wiped out specifically. With the loss of that designated marksman for that squad has lost about several hundred yards of range at their maximum. That guy was able to reach out to effectively 850 yards. Now, deprived of their designated marksman, that infantry squad probably has an effective range of about 500 yards, or even less, depending on the training of those Russian forces and how accurate they may be. But that's what we largely saw in that clip. Of course, can't show it here, but make sure to go click on the link in the description below and watch that if you'll want to see the video. This other one is also very interesting as well, because it actually shows Russian losses in the Stepove area on drone camera. Another thing that we cannot show live on air. The Russians have been advancing in Stepove in large form for days at this point, and we have seen that the losses have been significantly high around this incredibly small village. The Russians appear to have left a lot of them there where they fell, and y'all can see that in the video. It's about 5 minutes and 45 seconds of nothing but showing real Russian losses just lying in the fields around Stepove. Pretty graphic. We can't show it here on the stream, but we of course threw it on the map tonight, so that way all of y'all can get a true idea and a depiction of what this war really does look like. Moving on from that and into the area around the Avdiivka coke plant, we got to see that the 47th Magura did something really cool today, as they used an RBS-70 manpad from Sweden to shoot down a Zala drone. A very rare thing. We rarely ever see the Zalas, or the RBS being used, but we did get to see it today. We see them lining up the shot on the Zala, firing, and there goes the RBS's missile, and we can see it hit in the distance. And with that, I gotta say, a very impressive feat. Very good to see that Swedish arms manufacturing is, of course, top-notch. Like I always tell y'all, you know, if you want a good weapon, you get it from the Swedes. That's a guarantee. But moving on from the area of the Avdiivka coke plant in Tursk Kamyanka, we also got to hear from a Russian soldier himself that practically his entire unit had been wiped out. Out of the 70 guys that were in his company, only 14 of them are alive now. Here's the clip. New direction. I forgot to make a video of this trip. How long were we here? I'll say 8 days. For me, anyway. Avdiivka direction, closing the cauldron. We came here with 70 people. Now we have 14 left. All the rest are dead and wounded. When we came, this tree line was living. We were being destroyed, simply destroyed. Dead were here yesterday, they were removed. I can't show, but the front line is there. The Ukrainians are properly entrenched with concrete fire points. 500 meters away, we were pulled back as we couldn't compete. But how the F were we meant to be stormtroopers? In our group remaining, we have immobilized Dan, myself, and the Spanish. Behind this railway are the Ukrainians. We fight them all day long. We were shelled with grads. You could see the landscape, cratered with grad impacts. Further are the dead. They're all over the place. Not able to be evacuated because the Russians who would try and go up to evacuate them would come under Ukrainian fire, and so they're left behind. We can't even pull them out. Today we're meant to be withdrawn. No idea how that's going to work. Some shrapnel on his nose. That's it. Stanislav Sergeyevich became the senior. Also, Dan is senior now, meaning they were promoted to leaders of their squad because there's nobody left. We survived thanks to a developed self-preservation instinct, but you can't even imagine our tasks. Hopefully we'll live. Bleh, think I was spotted. And they were. Alright, take care. Video ends there. But out of that 70-man squad, introduced to the lines just 8 days ago, almost 70%, really 80% of the unit, has been obliterated in 8 days. 70 guys. There's now only 14 left. Everyone else, the nearly, let me think, it's 55 other guys, really 56 other guys, have all been wounded and killed, to the point that they have been sent back and they're no longer active parts of the unit. Those kinds of losses are very severe, especially over an 8-day period. That is suggesting that every single day, that squad of 70 guys was losing, and let me make sure that we get this correct. Let me do 56 divided by 8. For some reason, I can't do that in my head, but 56 divided by 8. Over the course of 8 days, they were losing around 7 guys on average every day killed and wounded. That kind of attrition rate is incredibly high, and if that is the standard for every single active squad that the Russians have that is directly on the front lines, we can assume that their rotation periods are incredibly fast, because most squads do not survive initial contact for the first few days and are usually attrited down to the point of non-existence. Hell, honestly, those forces right there, the 14 guys that are left that are still on that front line, they're going to be pulled back, most likely to Novoseliv-Kadruha, with other fragments of other platoons and companies that have been almost completely destroyed, and they're going to amalgamate them into brand new companies and probably send them right back to the lines, where they'll once again be praying and begging that they will be one of those 14 out of the 70 guys that will survive and go back to Novoseliv-Kadruha, most likely for them to reform a new company out of all the remaining fragments of all of the companies that have been wiped out, and then send them right back up to the front lines again. This kind of stuff is horrendous, and you can tell it's very bad for morale. This guy didn't really seem to be that enthused about being in the area, and not only that, they had not made any advances over those 8 days. They entered that tree line, and they have been there since, not moving a single inch forward. Moving on from that into the area around southern Avdiivka, we also got to see, for the first time ever, a BTR-90 being lost. A very interesting clip, and a very interesting armored personnel carrier experiment as well. The BTR-90 was the Russian attempt in the early part of the 2000s to try and give a little bit of extra firepower to their BTR series armored personnel carriers. They did this by mounting the turret of a BMP-2 onto the hull of a BTR. This, in theory, would give the BTR a bigger gun and a much more rapid rate of firepower. Even BTR-80s cannot support the rapid firepower of the 2A42 autocannon, although the gun on a normal BTR-82 is a 30mm autocannon as well, of a different variant with a lower rate of fire. This thing is probably a little bit less of a armored personnel carrier, and probably more so falling within the lines of an infantry fighting vehicle. But nevertheless, there's not many of these things. From what we know, there was only 12 of these produced, and they were produced in a time period of around 2004 to 2011, mostly as prototypes. We have seen that the Russians have apparently introduced a small number of these to the front lines, as one of them was visibly seen destroyed today near the area around Vodyane. We can see it right there. And we can easily tell that this is a BTR-90 because we can see one hatch open that is not symmetrical on the direct top of the turret. Also, by the way, turrets on most BTRs are incredibly small. Even on the BTR-80, their turret diameter is about the same as a PMP-1, or even a little bit less. We can tell that this one has a very large turret, a pretty decently long autocannon, showing us it's a 2A42 autocannon, and clearly indicating that this is not a BTR-80, a BTR-60, or a BTR-82. This is a BTR-90, one of only 12, and this is one of them that has been somewhat destroyed or abandoned, and now sitting out in this field to rot. It'll be interesting if the Ukrainians could get their hands on this BTR-90. It's not that it's new technology, it's really just a Frankenstein of old technologies. BMP-2 has been around since about the late 70s, and the BTR series APCs have been around even longer than that. I believe they were introduced in the mid-60s. So really just an amalgamation or a Frankenstein of older technologies, but a Russian attempt to increase firepower of their basic armored personnel carriers like the BTR series. Not really that successful, though, because they ended up ditching the project, and that's why there's only 12 of them. But moving on from that, and into our next bit of news, we also got to see that near the area of Vodyane, there was also a look around some of the fields out there, and we can't really show that on stream either. This video just showed y'all the losses of Russian forces that had been left behind in the fields to rot by the Russians themselves, but showing us that the losses were still astronomically high. The fields were littered with Russians to the point that if it was a field full of crops, it would be ripe for harvest, if you get what I'm saying, but still showing incredibly high losses nevertheless. Moving on from that little bit of news and on into the area of Pervomaiske, we also got to see Ukraine striking some BM-21 Grads, and this was apparently filmed by the drone. And so check it out. I want you to see the Grad barrage coming in, of course, wildly inaccurate, as all Grad barrages are, but blanketing the entire area. We can also geolocate this clip as well, which we will do in a second. And let me go back, because we can get a very clear geolocation here. We can see a lake with a flat side over here. And if we go to Prvomaiskoye, we'll be able to find that relatively easily. This barrage was being filmed by a drone right about here, where the mouse cursor is, looking towards the northwest, specifically at this side of the Novovdivsky Stavok, which is some kind of a lake directly beside Prvomaiskoye. We can also get an idea of the conditions of the buildings here within Prvomaiskoye. We can see a school, notably center of the town, and I believe we were able to see that on film as well. Let's take a look at what we can see. So, that appears to be the remnants of the school building that we were seeing here on Google satellite footage, right about here. And that does appear to line up. Let me see if I can get a street view. We cannot get a street view, sadly, but that does appear to be the school building, and it appears that over the very long amount of fighting that's been going on in this area, the school has been nearly completely destroyed and only has its structural walls standing. Oh, it looks like it may have been burned out from the inside. We can also see that a little bit further back, there was a small kind of a hospital back here, but sadly we did not see that in the film because it's obscured by the schoolhouse. Moving on from that, we can also see the street here directly alongside this lake. This gives us a good idea of how severe the damage has been over the past few months of fighting near Prvomaiskoye. This is what the street would have looked like before, and sadly, we still cannot get a street view of Prvomaiskoye, but we can get a look at what the roofing of these buildings look like. We can see a mixture of aluminum as well as actual shingles, and if we look at it in the modern day, at just the video that came out from 24 hours ago, we can see that every single building has been destroyed. Some of them have been destroyed quite thoroughly, all the way down to the foundation. Others have sustained moderate damage, but the street is completely unrecognizable from what it was pre-war. With that, that's the end of the clip, but showing us exactly where that barrage occurred, and it is good to know that the Ukrainians are attempting to barrage Russian forces in this area and make sure to wipe them out. Moving on from that into our next clip, we also get to see what winter looked like in Donetsk once more, and this was pretty interesting. Brought to you by none other than the Ukrainians themselves. Check it out. We're going to have to mute that. When you see this guy giving the stare, I wish I had someone look at me like this Ukrainian guy just looked at whatever's off the screen. We now see them loading the artillery piece and getting ready to fire. It looks like it may be a Rapira anti-tank gun being used in an indirect fire role. And we see them firing. The gun has now fired. We now see them taking the shell and getting ready to reload. This gun crew is a little bit slow, but nevertheless, they are still laying down fire. We now see them getting ready to fire once more. Firing. Or you can see the recoil of the piece. We now see them firing a third time here. And then we see them walking off at the end of the clip, but showing us a little bit of the gun crews operating in the winter near the Donetsk front, most likely in the direction near Prvomaiskoye or Avdiivka. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't know why I'm stuttering so much tonight. I think it's because I'm looking around trying to make sure that everything's running well in the live chat while also doing this, but please forgive me for that. Please forgive me. But moving on from that and into the area of Kalinove, we also get to see a HIMARS in operation in the Donetsk Oblast. And look at that. Isn't it beautiful? The The HIMARS is a very aesthetically pleasing MLRS system. Not only that, but they're also wildly effective as well. And due to them being wheeled instead of their tracked variant, the M270 Mars, which is a almost tank-looking variant of the MLRS, but it's also able to carry twice the amount of missiles. Instead of carrying 6 of them, the M270 carries 12. These are a lot more mobile, and therefore succeed in the shoot and scoot kind of a doctrine much more successfully, and are able to cover a larger area with less vehicles. Still, very nice to see them, and I love to know that the Ukrainians are still using this wonderful American firepower to make sure that the Russians are held back in the area and making sure to strike deep behind Russian lines, hitting the very critical nucleuses of the Russian armed forces that are able to keep them rolling. Moving on from that and into our next bit of news near Dolya, we also got to see the wreckage of a grad site after a HIMARS strike. And that thing was ripped apart pretty well.
Привет, малыш, блядь. Ха-ха-ха.
Oh,
Всё сгнило.
that's the way I laugh.
Бывает. У нас такой погодой все быстро очень гниет.
And with that, that's the end of the clip right there, but pretty freaking impressive. And I'd also like to take a quick moment before we move on into the next clip to thank you all so much for being so supportive tonight. I've seen a lot of y'all saying that the stream has been really enjoyable, even with only half of the crew here. I got to thank y'all for that, because it is always a little extra stressful to run a stream on my own. But I do have to say that it always makes it much more reassuring to do it on my own, especially when so many of y'all have so many kind words to say about how this channel is running. And so I got to thank all of y'all for that. I actually just saw 420 say it in the chat, and it was just incredibly nice. I've seen so many of y'all say things like that tonight. It really does mean a lot, and I thank y'all for that, because I'm always dedicated to the concept of making sure that I'm keeping this news coming out day after day. Sadly, Matthew was not able to join us tonight. Hopefully he'll be able to join us on Tuesday. But it just means a great deal to me. And I want y'all to know that I'm so appreciative, not only of y'all supporting me and, you know, letting me know that it's a good job of news coverage, but also supporting Ukraine as well. This fundraiser has been a massive success tonight. With only a goal of $3,000, we reached $5.4 thousand raised. $2.4 thousand over the fundraiser goal, and almost twice of what I was expecting we would reach. And I know it's Christmas, and it's getting very close to Christmas. Christmas is only 15 days away. And I know that so many of y'all, much like I am, are having to focus on getting Christmas presents for folks, and so budgets are getting very, very strict or very constrained. And it's blown me away to see that we've been able to once again reach what would be over a normal fundraiser goal tonight. Not only that, to help to save so many Ukrainian lives. And so thank you all so much once again for just being an amazing community and being so supportive as I continue to try and make sure that we keep this thing rolling. And so with that, we are now going to be moving on into the area of Marinka, where we got to see an ATGM knocking out a tank and an attack faltering as a result of the ATGM destroying the Russian tank. From what we can tell, this was filmed by the an Air Assault Brigade. Unfortunately, I don't know this exact emblem. But we can see the ATGM firing. We can see the trail of the missile right there. We see the Russian tank that's going to be the target. It's right in the middle of the column of tanks that's advancing. And poof, it gets hit. It looks like there may have been some kind of an ammo detonation, possibly. And now we can see it on normal view. We can see the tank in the rear of the column stop. We can see the lead tank continuing to advance. And we can now see some other Russian tank burning. This may have been the lead vehicle later on. And with that, that's the end of that clip. Very nice to see, and of course, wonderful to know. Moving on from that and into the area of Novomikhailivka, we also saw that assault near Marinka that was stopped by that ATGM also appears to have been accompanied in Novomikhailivka by a very similar assault with an armored column as well, possibly showing that the Russians were attempting to probe the lines today and see if they could make an opportunistic push towards the village of Kurakove, which is about 5 miles behind Marinka. But moving on to this clip, we also saw that this attack was thwarted as well, very successfully by Ukrainian forces, as they blew up the vehicle on the spot. We're trying to show y'all that vehicle, hopefully without the rock and the copyright. And welcome back, Plexus Gaming! And we can see the armored vehicle getting hit right there. Very nice, and wonderful to know that they were able to, of course, make sure that the Russians would not be able to advance in that direction. Moving on out of that area and a little bit further down, and also really quickly, by the way, everyone, I know that I'm not really that active in the chat. Sadly, I can't be because I got to make sure that we keep the news running because it's 10:40 or so, and we still have a lot to cover. Always make sure to be active in the chat. Tell me anything you want. Tell me a little bit of a history fun fact, what you think about rifles, what you think about the Ukrainians are using right now. Talk about anything, because the more y'all say in the live chat, the more I have to respond to. And if there's something very interesting and relevant to what we're watching, I'll make sure to bring up your comment in the live chat, and I'll talk about it on air. So make sure to throw in anything you want, because I might be able to talk about that while we're live. And so moving on from that, we also got to see that the 68th Jaeger was hitting some Russian forces with some drone-dropped explosives. But this apparently was a little too spicy, and it was a little too spicy, but make sure to go check that out if you would like. Link in the description below for the day 655 map, and you will be able to see things that I cannot show on YouTube. Moving on from that area and a little bit further down to the direction of Poloki, we also got to see that the Russians are starting to employ a new kind of anti-drone warfare, and it involves a heavy usage of nets and trench protection. This is a very interesting picture right here, because we can see that the Russians are covering their trenches with tarps and mesh, most likely to stop the drones from flying into the trench and exploding within them. Instead, they'll explode above them and possibly mitigate the shrapnel and explosive damage that the drones would be causing. We can also see in the next picture that this is a very extensive trench work with these kinds of anti-drone protections, and we can see that in some places, like this part of the Surovikin line, anti-drone measures are being taken literally everywhere. It appears they're also giving a small break in the cover, so that way riflemen can still fire from the trenches, but this may start to pose additional issues for Ukrainian kamikaze drones that fly directly into the trenches to explode. This may be why we're seeing the Ukrainians starting to experiment with shotgun blast drones, like we just saw a little while ago, because those would be able to be used with that kind of cover being there. It will be able to fire pretty much at the trench as kind of an impromptu shotgun or a rifle, and hopefully take out Russian soldiers by injuring them or taking them out that way. But a very interesting look at how Russian doctrines are changing at a monolithic rate. It's hardly happening, but it's still starting to change. Moving on from that and into our next little bit of news, we also got to see the 82nd hitting some Russians near Verbove. And that apparently was also a little spicy, so sadly I won't be able to show that to y'all, but I'd highly recommend checking it out off screen. Moving on from that little bit of news, and a huge shout out to Harvey the drummer, who just threw in a 50 to the fundraiser, getting it on up to $5,462. Absolutely amazing. We're now going to be moving on into the next segment of news, which is a little bit short, but I still want to make sure that we cover it because many of y'all are interested in topics around the world. And while we are a almost entirely Ukrainian news channel and pro-Ukrainian all the way, there are some conflicts going on down in the Middle East that also have some decent impact on the Western world. We can see down in the area around the southern Red Sea, today another drone attack occurred, but not this time on a US destroyer or a merchant vessel. This time the attacks were thwarted by a French frigate. And we actually have a picture of it right here from OSINT Technical. This is the French frigate Languedoc. And sadly, I know I'm mispronouncing that. I'm so sorry to all the French-speaking people who are here. I'm mispronouncing this very heavily. But this is a Frem-class frigate, a pretty common one in the French Navy. And this was the one that we were told shot down 2 Yemeni drones about 110 kilometers away from the capital city of Hodeida today. It appears that not only is the U.S. and normal commercial shipping being the threat, or, well, under the threat of Yemeni drone attacks, it also appears that these attacks are now expanding into European nations' navies as well, including the French. We'll be seeing what kind of response occurs. There may start to become conversations of a coalition response to the Houthis inside of Yemen if these attacks continue indiscriminately on really any Western nation, including the French. Moving on from that little bit of news in the southern area of the Red Sea and moving on up into southern Lebanon, we did also see that the Israelis are starting to conduct airstrikes in the area with an increasing frequency. From what we understand, Hezbollah forces are amassing along the southern Lebanese border, and this is leading the Israelis to try and find these areas, and in this video, they ended up carpet bombing believed Hezbollah locations. We hear the sounds of the explosions. And that's the end of the clip, but showing us that the Israeli Air Force is taking additional actions against Hezbollah buildups in southern Lebanon and attempting to destroy them before they can begin attacks against the Israeli FOBs that line the border in that region of the country. Moving on down from the area of southern Lebanon and into the area of the Gaza Strip, we have seen that Israeli offensive actions through the city of Gaza and also an offensive towards Han Yunis are full underway. And we did see today some firefighting within the Jabalia refugee camp, which we saw on film right here. We see them using some kind of a grenade launcher, possibly some sort of a Mark 19, although it didn't really look like it. Huge shout out to Michelle Neely, who threw in a 50. We see the Israelis running up to the rear of a Merkava, running through the streets past the Namera APC. And you can see them using a sledgehammer to try and break down an iron gate. When you see them defusing some kind of an anti-tank mine left behind by Hamas. And we see a rifle grenadier firing rifle grenades. That's the end of those clips, but showing continued actions by the Israeli Defense Forces within the area of the Jabalia refugee camp, which is really just a part of Gaza City, but they call it a refugee camp just for, giggles, I suppose. But moving on from that and into our next clip, we also saw once again that the Israeli Defense Forces have decided not to use their M109s for the most part in artillery roles, but to use them in direct fire roles, using them pretty much as assault guns. We rarely ever see this in modern warfare. This is actually a rare instance of the M109s being used in this way. The M109 can be used like an assault gun, which is where you take a larger caliber gun, like the one inside of the M109, and just roll it directly into a city and start blasting its stuff directly in front of it. The U.S. actually used this a little bit, well, at least an idea of this, in the Battle of Aachen during World War II, quite famously, as they rolled in a 155mm Big Tom artillery piece and just started blasting buildings away with it, pretty much at point-blank range. The Soviet Union was famously known for using this kind of strategy when fighting inside of big cities, and very commonly within the Battle of Berlin at the very end of World War II. It was very easy to see some kind of a massive Russian artillery piece, usually 152mm or larger, being fired within the city streets of Berlin, directly against buildings that were about 50 yards in front of it. But we can see right here, it hitting the building in front of it. But with that, that's the end of the clip. Pretty interesting to see, and very interesting to know that the Israelis are using that kind of a system in a direct fire role. Moving on from that and into the area of Beit Hanun, we also saw that a Israeli air evac unit was pulling out some troops from the area of the town today. You see the helicopters coming in? Where you see them ushering over the stretcher bearers as they load up the wounded and prepare to send them out. And the helicopters are now on their way, literally after 20 seconds of getting the wounded on board. With that, we're now going to be moving on from that interesting little bit of news right there and down into the direction of Han Yunis. And really quickly, I'd actually like to take a moment to address something I saw in the live chat. I see someone has come in, it's called Joel Finkel, and they're saying that the IDF is committing genocide. I doubt many of you know about Palestine. And that's an interesting assertion to make. What do you know about Palestine? Let us know in the live chat what you know about Palestine, Joel, that many of us don't know, because apparently you hold infinite wisdom over the area compared to all of us. And so let me know. Let me know. And also another question from Anonymous. He said, "Do you think Israel is making a serious threat to the U.S. of taking out the Houthi rebels, or are they just whistling Dixie?" They may actually be making a serious threat, but it's going to be very difficult for the Israelis to power project onto the other end of the Arabian Peninsula. So while it may be serious in its intent, in its actual follow-through, it's most likely whistling Dixie, in all honesty. The Israelis don't have a large navy that could support a ground force that far away, or an air force, for that matter, that has an airlift wing that could support forces that far away. So, you know, we don't really think they'd have the ability to actually crush the Houthis. That's most likely something the U.S. or a coalition would have to do of larger European nations to be able to try and crush the Houthis, or something that the Saudis, the Yemenis, and the United States could work on collectively is crushing the Houthis through a combined coalition down there. But with that, we're now going to be moving on into our last clip, into the area of Han Yunis, where we got to see that the Israelis were finding even more weapon stashes. A decent amount of AKs, AK-47s in particular. Some grenades, Balfang radio. But that's the end of that clip. I don't know why I was starting to watch that a second time. I think I zoned out right there. And I zoned out because I was looking into the live chat, and I saw something kind of interesting. Joel Finkel has actually given a response, and he says, "I know of the histories of Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine." And I would have to say you probably don't, because it's not as straight cut and clear as you're making it out to be. And also, let's see here. In 1947 to 1949, Israel forcibly expelled 750 Palestinians from their homes and destroyed 420 villages. That's not necessarily true, and that also is simplifying something into claims that aren't really true. You see, before Israel or Palestine existed as a concept, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. We're going to start the story when the first Jews started to arrive around the 1890s. The Jews had largely been kicked out of Israel through several hundred years previously of religious and diasporas and somewhat nearly ethnic cleansings in the later part of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire of the late 1700s and the 1800s wasn't really the Ottoman Empire of the earlier times in history, from about the 1400s to the 1600s, where they actually allowed religious freedoms, but at the same time also had some penalties for people who were not Islamic. Around the time of the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was starting to run into some economic straits. Throughout most of Europe, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe due to these economic troubles. Because of this, the local Ottoman government within what would be called modern-day Palestine, if that's what you want to call it, Joel, they started to try and look for ways to finance the area. There wasn't really anyone living there anyways, and nobody really cared about it. And there was a new movement within the Jewish religion called Zionism. And many of y'all have heard about it. You know, it's been made out to be evil, whatnot. But many Zionists actually had two different ideas for where a Jewish state could exist, where Jewish people would actually live without being forced into multiple diasporas and expulsions by all the many countries that they had inhabited over several hundred years. They either were going to pick an area within Brazil or an area within Israel. And the Zionists ended up picking Israel because that was the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. The first time that the Jews were ever mentioned as living within the land of Israel, and the kingdom of Israel was specifically mentioned by name, was on an Egyptian tablet that was written around 1550 BC, showing that the Jewish people had been around in the area since about 1550 BC, predating the Islamic Palestinians by about 2,000 years. Nevertheless, that's why they picked the area, and luckily, everything kind of fell into place. The Ottoman Empire, and specifically the regional governors that were running the region of Palestine within the Ottoman Empire, started to sell land, specifically where Tel Aviv exists today. And this is how Tel Aviv actually came into being. The Zionist Jews, who were trying to move from Europe and into this homeland that they were going to have, started to buy up massive plots of property where Tel Aviv exists today. And out of this, they would end up creating a Jewish enclave that would exist within the city of Tel Aviv and largely got along a little bit with the Palestinians, but that started to actually change towards the latter part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire would cease to exist in 1917, and before the First World War broke out in 1914, there was starting to become a very large influx of Jewish migrants heading into Tel Aviv legally. There was nothing, and many people, like Joel, who's still insisting that the history is incorrect that I'm telling, although I'm a history major, so I had to actually study the stuff, and I have a bachelor's degree to show for it. They ended up migrating legally, both under the Palestine Mandate, which would exist after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and was ruled by the British from the realm of around 1918 to around 1947. The Jewish people were legally migrating, and this ended up causing a little bit of a problem. The Palestinians, the Islamic Palestinians within the area, were not happy with the idea of the Jews rapidly beginning to match the Muslims living in the area in scale. The Jews were migrating in large numbers, by the way. I forgot to mention this. That's why Tel Aviv is such a large city, even back then. They were starting to move in so quickly that the Jews were actually demanding that they have some kind of a representation within the local regional government within that area. And they started to get it because there was just such a large number of them. This started to anger the Palestinians, who started to organize armed militias, pretty much, to start attacking the Jews and try and force them back out of the area. In response, the Jewish settlers, now within Tel Aviv, began to also organize their own armed militias to respond to the Palestinians. And you would actually see that these groups would exist until Israeli independence in 1947 that was given to them by the British. After World War I ended, the territory transitioned from being Ottoman-controlled in the Ottoman Empire to a part of the British Mandate of Palestine, and also there were several other mandates that were created as well by the British. There was the British Mandate of Transjordan, which back then it wasn't called Jordan, it was called Transjordan, and there was also the British Mandate of Iraq. All of these countries were supposed to be released from the British Mandate after several decades because the British were going to be allowed a while to try and make sure that they were going to be able to form long-lasting governments within this region and figure out how it worked. There's been a lot of controversy whether it worked or not in hindsight. The British didn't really factor everything in, and also they didn't have all the territory under their control to factor everything in. Like, for example, Hindustan, which would have existed if the area had a little bit more wiggle room. But there was a bit of a problem, but that's a story for another time. Anyways, getting back to Israel, throughout the 1920s, the 30s, and the 40s, there was constant clashes in between the Jewish people who had lived within the area of Tel Aviv, as well as the Palestinians that were in that area as well. And also, let me make sure. Let's see, no one gave the British the right to colonize Palestine. Well, who gave the Ottomans the right to colonize Palestine, and who gave the right to Muhammad to be able to invade, well, actually not Muhammad, but to the Islamic people in around 550 AD for them to invade the modern-day area of Israel, because before then, no Muslim had ever stepped foot or lived within the area of Israel up until 550 AD, while the Kingdom of Israel and Jewish people had existed in the area since 1550 BC, and there's clear, verifiable evidence that they had existed in that area, even by Egyptian accounts and records of the time. So it's a little hard to say that the British colonized it as well, considering that the Ottoman Empire had literally collapsed by the time of 1918, and so it was the responsibility of the British and also the French to take control of these areas, considering that the Ottoman Empire was a belligerent in World War I and a part of the Axis powers, to take control of these areas and to try and form nations that would last well after the British and French had left. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to argue that. Let's see here. Let's see. The British gave themselves the right. The British actually didn't give themselves the right. That's something a little interesting. The British didn't go in and say, okay, we're colonizing this place. They actually had a discussion with the League of Nations, which had just been created at the end of World War I, to figure out who was going to do this. Who in the world was going to be the nations that were going to try and stabilize this part of the Middle East and create long-lasting nations. And it ended up being the French and the British who got all the responsibilities of doing that. So it wasn't colonization. And on top of that, there was a clear time and date when the mandates would end, which was 1947. Every single one of those countries was going to be an independent nation by the year 1947. It's just that in that process, from 1918 to then, the British and the French were going to control these areas, police them, and make sure to allow these civil governments and bodies to form somewhat naturally. And so, let's see. In the source of creation said there's no verifiable evidence that the Jews exist in that area during ancient times. You were lying. Well, I have a feeling that the tablet from 1550 BC in Egypt that still exists to this day, that mentions the Kingdom of Israel directly by name, I have a feeling that that would be a pretty verifiable proof of evidence. But if you know more than me, I'll take it for what it is. But nevertheless, let's see, the Balfour Declaration opposed by, why in the world would it be opposed? Yeah, I'm going to have to say this really quickly. Sadly, I'm going to have to stop arguing with you because I'm trying to tell you the history of the place. I mean, I didn't study 4 years of history for nothing, and this was also a part of it, to get a bachelor's degree in history to be able to talk about history with a decent amount of credibility. I hate to tell you, man, I'm going to have to stop talking to you because you're just throwing out like quick little slogans, and the slogans don't even stand up to any historical accounts. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm seeing you say in two different instances, you're saying that the Palestinians are descendants of the Jews, which can't be true, because if they were descendants of the Jews, why do they hate the Jews? That doesn't make any sense at all. So, you know, there's a contradiction there, but it doesn't even make a lot of sense. And I'm really having a hard time arguing with you because you're not giving any historical facts. You're just saying I'm wrong, and you're also not really doing anything. So, let's see. Opposed by the Jews and the British Foreign Service. I would have to disagree with you because if that was true, how come the Balfour Declaration was supported by the Jews, and that's why they ended up continuing to migrate in even larger numbers and even faster once the Balfour Declaration was made? So that's a very interesting little bit of a conundrum there, and I'm not really getting a lot of explanations from you. I'm just getting, you know, I'm not getting it. You're saying DNA studies prove it, but how? Because here's the problem: you can't say they're descendants of the Jews because a Islamic community had existed within Palestine at least since 550 AD. So there's no way that they could have been descendants of the Israelis that moved in the 1880s because they had been there technically for much longer than the 1880s. They had been there since about, about 600 AD at least. So with that, sorry, but we're going to have to move on from that. Interesting conversation, but still not that good. But moving on from that, we're moving up to Kyiv to cover the speech from President Volodymyr Zelenskyy here on day 655 of the war. And so, without further ado, here's the speech. An incredibly short one, but speech!
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці, українки. Сьогодні увесь день зустрічі та перемовини в Аргентині. Навіть ширше сьогодні Україну тут почули і інші держави Латинської Америки. Представив Україну на інаугурації нового президента Аргентини, провів перші перемовини з Хав'єром. Сьогодні тут на площах, на вулицях багато скандували слово «свобода», «лібертат». І це те, що нас відчутно поєднує Україну і Аргентину. Наші народи, які понад усе цінують свободу, свою ідентичність і прагнуть жити достойно. Хав'єр хоче сили для своєї країни, і я відчув прагне чесності міжнародним відносинам. Я подякував йому за підтримку України, запросив разом з нами працювати заради відновлення миру. Обговорили двосторонню співпрацю між нашими країнами, яка може додати економічної міцності та робочих місць для наших народів. Хороша світла зустріч. Я щиро бажаю Аргентині правильних рішень та стійкого зростання. Хай бідності стане менше, сили більше, хай свобода тільки зростає. Тут же в Буенос-Айресі провів перемовини ще з 3 лідерами країн регіону – Парагвай, Уругвай, Еквадор. Обговорили нашу міжнародну роботу, з ними нашу співпрацю. На полях інаугурації говорив з прем'єр-міністром Угорщини Орбаном максимально відверто. І зрозуміло, що про наші європейські справи. Сьогодні ж говорив з президентом Франції Макроном та президенткою Єврокомісії Урсулою фон дер Ляєн 2 телефонні розмови про спільну роботу на рівні Євросоюзу, про спільний захист Європи. Вдячний за підтримку. Зустрівся з нашою громадою в Аргентині, з тими українцями, чиє коріння тут сягає глибини десятки років. Вдячний за збереження нашої української культури, нашої ідентичності, нашої мови. Я вдячний за те, що зв'язок з Україною зберігається попри географію, попри будь-які негаразди. Завтра і післязавтра разом з командою буду в Вашингтоні. Заплановані зустрічі, перемовини. Президент Байден, Конгрес, вагомі речі. Кожен день, кожну годину використовуємо, щоб дати Україні, нашому народу, більше. Дати більше можливостей, дати більше захисту, більше сили. Я дякую всім, хто допомагає, дякую всім, хто б'ється і працює заради інтересів нашої держави, нашого суспільства, нашої свободи, нашої перемоги. Слава Україні!
And the Rum Slava. And with that, we have wrapped up the news for the night here on day 655 of the news of the war in Ukraine. And we are now going to be moving on into the next segment. For about the next 30 minutes, I'll be able to answer questions from inside the live chat. And of course, some interesting discussions have been had. And of course, we will be making sure to let some interesting conversations be had about everything. So if you want to talk about the war in Ukraine, or if you want to talk about the war in Israel, make sure to throw your questions in right now and keep throwing them in. Just, make sure to know there are probably a lot of questions that will be thrown in. Last time I did this on the stream, there were probably about, I think, 50 questions that were thrown in. It was very hard to be able to pick ones because they were all incredibly good. I'll be trying to get to as many of them as I can, but I won't be able to get to all of them. I'm very sorry for that, but still ask your question because there's a good chance I might be able to try and get to answering it. And so let me see here, and let me go through the live chat. Let's see here. And also, by the way, really quickly, because I see that Joel and many others are still continuing to say that there was no proof of Israel's existence in ancient times, I actually found the Mernatov Stele, which is the tablet that I was referring to in the conversation that mentioned the existence of a kingdom of Israel or an Israel of any form, suggesting that the Jewish people, at least the religion of Judaism, had existed since about the point of 1200 BC. Which still, although my years were off by nearly 300 years, it still predates Islam by nearly, at least at this being our minimum understanding of the existence of Israel starting at 1200 BC, it still outdates the existence of Islam by nearly 1700 years, meaning that is something important to note. This is housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and somewhere about right here, from what I remember, is the hieroglyphics that specifically mention the Kingdom of Israel. So, by historic accounts, of course, excluding the Bible, because, of course, people who are in these arguments never want to use the Bible for proof for some reason, although it is largely one of the few historical accounts from the region and the time. Whether you want to say it's accurate or not, that's a whole thing. It's usually accounted like it was when I was being taught, early ancient history, which was a decent amount. I was told by the guy who ran the history department, the Bible is usually used as a pretty decent idea of at least some of the framework of how ancient history unfolded, at least loosely, to try and get a bit of an idea of where everything falls in, at least a little bit. But nevertheless, it does specifically mention the nation of Israel. It's also stated right there, but that was the one I was using. Anyways, with that, we got to make sure to answer the question. And also, very cool one, Word Guy, or W13RD Guy, said, what happened to the Uzi? Does anybody use it? Or does the IDF use it? The Uzi has kind of fallen out of form. It was a pretty good little SMG back in the day, but I think a lot of people have just started to kind of move on from the thing. Really nothing against it. It's just that I don't, I gotta be honest, I'm not really a big fan of that thing. It's just, it's alright. And also, you see it here. That's what the Uzi looks like. Let me see if there are any current operators of this thing. Let's see. It looks like apparently some of them have been used in the Russo-Ukrainian War of the 2020s, but it doesn't really get used by any mainstream groups anymore, mostly because it may be a bit of a dated design. So that would be my understanding of it, but once again, I don't really know much about the Uzi. I kind of had to pull it up right there to know. But let's see. Neil Invisinon threw in a pretty interesting comment saying, everyone seems to forget that at the beginning of the war, Putin said he would launch nuclear weapons if the Russian Federation collapsed. He did say that, but I have a feeling that would be a bit of a stretch because if the Russian government was so weak that the government was collapsing naturally, he probably wouldn't even have the power or the sway anymore to launch nuclear weapons. So while that may be true, and I would say that that's something that does need to be kept in the back of everyone's minds, I have a feeling that would be very hard for him to execute or follow through on that stated course of action right there, at least in my opinion. But, of course, there is always a chance for me to be wrong. And so let's see here. Let's see, looking through and trying to see what else we've got here. And let me go back up here. Von Delta said, Enforcer, what is your opinion on why the US and NATO are piecemeal providing weapons? Also, Jews and Arabs are related, both descend from Abraham. Well, while they may be related, technically everyone in the world is related through some kind of an extension. Everyone's going to be related to some extent. You still can't really rule that in as being like they're like blood brothers, because technically the Ukrainians and the Russians are very easily culturally related. In fact, they're nearly identical to each other as far as the cultural tree goes. The Ukrainians were largely the existing culture, and the Russians are not that far of an offshoot in reality, but they are completely different in the modern world. And that's why when we look at the situation down here, we can't really say ancestrally they're similar, because that ancestrally similar comes from nearly 2,000 years ago or somewhere around that time. So it'd make it very difficult to try and argue that they're similar cultural groups, especially considering that their ideological differences make them nearly polar opposites, at least in the modern day. But I see what you're saying, though. But also, to address the other part of that question, let's see. I'll make sure to find it again. Dang, I can't find it again. I'm sorry. I'll have to leave the answer there. But still, pretty interesting comment, because it's true, but still at the same time, with how the modern world's developed, it isn't really that applicable, as much as it could be. But with that, let's see here. What's a good excuse for a CCW? I'm not even going to get into that one. Let's see. Let's see. Believing. Let's see here. Let's see. See, someone said that's wrong date. Pearl Harbor was in December 9th. No, it was December 7th. And I actually brought that up. I said when the air attack happened on December 7th by the Russians, which is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, it did happen on December 7th because it was December 8th when Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the Congress and said that it was a day that will live in infamy. Let's see. Walter A. Lakota actually gave it a little bit of an answer to how the Uzi has kind of fallen out of favor. He said, one reason the Uzi is not in use anymore is because the rear sight and charging handle is one and the same. It has a tendency to cut your palm open when charging the weapon. Ew. Yeah, that would probably be a good reason not to use it anymore. I just don't really like the look of it. I don't like the look of the Uzi and the MAC-10. They're just too boxy to me, and I feel like they aren't the best kinds of SMGs out there, at least in my opinion. But thank you for sharing that, Walter, because I did not know that about the Uzi, although maybe one day we'll be able to get our hands on one and try and review it here on the channel. But let's see here. Christian Cruz said, one of my friends are building FPV drones in Ukraine, and they cost about $380. Is the cheap drones the future of warfare, or will electronic warfare systems stop that? For now, it's certainly the future of warfare, but electronic warfare systems will eventually become effective enough to be able to stop these kinds of drones from being usable. And then you will see the inevitable electronic warfare and drone arms race that always happens in every field of weaponry, where the drones eventually are made where they can outdo the currently existing electronic warfare devices, and then in response to that, they'll engineer electronic warfare devices that can neutralize the new drones, and then they'll go back and just continue that cycle on and on and on. That's why development of weapons is always happening, because everyone always wants something that'll be able to outdo the other. When the United States designed the F-4 Phantom, the Russians then went and designed the MiG-29. In response to the MiG-29, we started to develop the F-16 and the F-15. The Russians then developed the Su-27, also as a response to the F-4, and then by that point, we started to, I got the dates wrong. The F-16 and the F-15 were introduced, and by that point, the Russians then tried to design the Su-27 as a direct competitor to the F-15, and so on and so forth. The the improvements are always trying to make sure that you're able to overpower your opponent in some way. And that's why we'll see that right now, these FPV drones, the very cheap ones, are the kings of war, at least at the moment. But as time goes by, they will be outdone by the electronic warfare systems, and they're going to have to redesign brand new and probably more expensive FPV drones to be able to overcome those new electronic warfare systems. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. And also, Walter A. Lakota was able to back up that the attack on Pearl Harbor was on December 7th, and FDR made the declaration of war on December 8th, or more so made the speech, the date which will live in infamy speech, on the 8th of December. So that is correct dating right there. Let's see. And let's see here. Drones have been traceable in the USA for years. That's true. That's completely true, actually. And usually, you have to end up registering drones with the FAA, depending on what kind of drone it may be. If they're larger drones, they can break the the maximum altitude ceiling that's allowed by the FAA for recreational drones. You end up having to license it with the FAA to get approval to be able to fly it above that altitude. But let's see. Let's see here. And You're Taking My Life said, the channel What's Going On with Shipping had a video today talking about the Houthi government officially declaring a blockade on all commercial shipping passing Yemen. Have you heard this? I have not, actually. That would be a little bit of news to me, but it does appear to be in line with what they've been doing. They have been attacking almost every kind of commercial shipping passing through the area of the southern Red Sea, and so it appears that that official announcement may just be an extension of their actions, more so than a new statement of policy. But I haven't heard about that, but I will look into it. And let's see here. Walter A. Lakota threw in another statement. The Pearl Harbor attack happened on 7/10 on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And that was a very unfortunate time. Probably the worst time of the day to do it as well, from what I recall, because everybody was pretty much on leave from the ships. They were out, doing their thing, enjoying the day. And also it was pretty much early in the morning. The U.S. Navy was not expecting any kind of an attack coming. The radar station, which I believe was somewhere... Dang, I'd have to have your help with that, Walter A. Lakota. But there was a radar station on Hawaii that picked up an incoming large group of aircraft, but they mistook it to be the flight of B-17s that was actually coming into Hawaii that day. So they didn't notify anyone of the incoming attack. And so when the attack happened, everyone was completely caught off guard on the middle of a very early Sunday morning. Probably... I would assume a lot of them were probably going to also be getting ready for Sunday service as well. So that was probably the worst time that the attack could have happened on that day, but it did happen. And thank you for sharing that little fun fact as well, because Walter E. Lakota, if y'all don't know, is pretty much our in-house Hawaii historian, because he's actually from Hawaii and knows a great deal about the country's, well, not the country, but the kingdom's history, although it's now a state. But with that, hope that does address that well. And TechBlitz asked a question. TechBlitz said, the Enforcer, was the counteroffensive a fail after the first 4 days when Zelenskyy changed the U.S. suggested battle plan back to the original Ukrainian doctrine and decided to send in small groups of troops instead of a single big push? I would say that may be a bit of the blame as to why the counteroffensive failed. It appears that the U.S. doctrine was looked upon untrustingly by Ukrainian commanders because they didn't really know how this new doctrine was going to work, and so they switched back pretty much within the first week back to the original Ukrainian doctrine of conducting Soviet-style assaults, or modified Soviet-style doctrine. So I would say that that may have been a reason why it failed, because we saw that they were making progress in Arikiv down to Rabotny, and then once they started to change the doctrine, we saw that the progress was much less or completely non-existent. Although I would assume that the casualties probably did drop as a result of that doctrinal change, the amount of progress they made in reaching their offensive goals certainly dropped off almost completely. So I would say that that's part of the blame as to why that southern offensive in the summer possibly failed at its even secondary offensive objectives. And so with that, and also thank you for sharing that. I did not know that, Jose. But with that, we will be keeping an eye on that, Jose. And with that, we are moving on into the next one. And Walter A. Lakota says at the Kahuku, it's at Kahuku on the northernmost point of Oahu. And so now we know where that little radar installation was that I was talking about with the little thing happening at Pearl Harbor. So let me go here, Kahuku, and the radar station was somewhere up here. Wait, this is a range? Oh, crap, this is like a pistol range? If it is, that's cool. But where in the world is the radar installation? Maybe they got rid of it. after the war. Maybe they did, because I'm not seeing you up here. But thank you for sharing that. And also, Mark threw in a $50 donation. Thank you for joining in on the fundraiser, Mark, because you just got it up to 5.7 thousand. Really nice, I must say. And let's see here. What else? Let's see. Putin's Stamp On, interesting name. He said, Adam, you're right. There wasn't an official Palestinian state, but there wasn't an official Israeli state either until there was. So your point is irrelevant. I don't know why pro-Israel uses that argument. Well, because there was an official Israeli state that existed around 1200 BC and was confirmed by Egyptian accounts because they said that they defeated the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel at that time. So there is an account that an official Israeli state did exist for quite a period of time during that era. And going off of the rule on this channel, we go off of whoever was there first has claim to the land. And from what we know with Ukraine, the Scythians that existed in this area evolved into the Kievan Rus after the Viking raids, kind of mixed the cultures together along the Dnieper River, and ended up creating the Kievan Rus as a cultural group. That cultural group then splintered after the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, and we saw that some of the Kievan Rus remained, although weakened to the point of near non-existence on the Ukrainian steppe, and then a decent amount of the Kievan Rus moved on into the area around modern-day Nizhny Novgorod and also Moscow, creating Muscovy, Nizhny Novgorod, and a couple of other smaller kingdoms that would later go on to form the Russian Federation and the Russians as a culture. Going off of the cultural rules we use from Ukraine, stating that the Ukrainians have ancestral rights to the land, we would also be using the same argument on Israel as well. Whatever culture was existing first has a larger legitimacy and claim to the land. And going off of that, and knowing that we have confirmed proof of the Kingdom of Israel existing nearly 1700 years before the religion of Islam would even be able to exist to make a claim on the land that now exists where Palestine or Israel is, we would have to use the same rule we used in Ukraine and say that the Israelis are the legitimate claim holders to that land. That's why we justify it that way. Because you see, if we justify Palestine claiming all of Israel, that actually means we justify Russia claiming all of Ukraine as well. Because, you know, at some point, the Russian Empire did control Ukrainian land. It was much longer after the Ukrainians even existed there. The Ukrainians started to exist in the area even in the form of the Kievan Rus around 1200 AD. The Russian Empire would take over the lands of Ukraine around the time of the 1700s, the very early 1700s. So going off of that kind of an idea and that kind of a logic, the Russians actually would have a claim to the land because they're there. They were there at some point. But that's not how we justify things on this channel. Whoever was there first has the most legitimate claim holding to the land. And so going off of that, the Israelis are the ones who have a legitimate land claim to the entire area of Israel, not just the areas of what we see as the internationally recognized borders of Israel, but they also have a claim to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I don't think that they should take over and control the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but that's another thing for another time. Still, let's see. Trying to look through and see what else we have. And also, I'd like to ask if all of y'all keep it civil in the live chat about that argument, because I'm allowing the argument to be made for either side, you know, because, you know, while I'm pro-Israeli, you know, it's something I'm allowing an argument on because it's an interesting thing, and, you know, just keep it civil. That's really all I'm trying to say. I don't think all of y'all should be trying to, you know, kill each other over differing opinions. Don't people already do that out there in the world enough already and doesn't really solve anything? So let's try and keep it civil. And so, let's see here. Joel Finkel said Jews have been in Ukraine for 1,000 years, 1,000 plus years. Yes, but they have been in other countries for 1,000 plus years or so because they were pushed out of Israel back around the 600 ADs. A lot of them were, and a lot of them ended up being expulsed. Some of them would end up returning under Ottoman rule later. That would happen after about the 1400s or so, but a lot of them ended up being spread out into the diaspora across Europe, and that's why there were so many ethnic Jews that were living throughout Europe for the Holocaust to even occur in the 1940s, is because they were originally expelled from Israel back during the original Islamic invasions around 600 AD into where they were, which was Israel. But with that, I hope that does address that well, at least to me. And let's see. And let's see, Aline Shaddle said, who existed longer, the Jews or the Muslims? End of argument. That's kind of how we rule that decision on this channel. And really the end of the argument is the Jews did exist historically far longer than the Muslims did, or the Islamic people did, and therefore they have the claim to the land. I mean, you know, and I'm sure some people are about to say, well, what about the Christians? Well, the Christians existed a lot sooner than the Jews did. The Christianity came around about the time of 30 AD. And so still, by historical accounts, the Jews existed for nearly 1,200 years, at least, before Christianity ever arrived onto the scene, and therefore they still have legitimate claim to the land. Because while Jews are a religion, Jews are also a cultural group as well, and are largely consistent throughout most of the world with their cultural beliefs. And so, usually, religion is not the determining factor in a cultural group. Usually, it's other defining features, but Judaism in itself pretty much creates its own culture, and therefore we apply the cultural rules of land claims to just the religion of Judaism as a whole. So that's how that kind of works. Not really the same, though, with Islam, because Islam actually does have some pretty decent cultural differences from region to region. Turkish Muslims are very different than Iraqi Muslims, and Iraqi Muslims are pretty different than Saudi Arabian Muslims. And then you have the Shiites and the Sunnis, and it starts to devolve into an incredibly large amount of similar but still different cultural groups. You don't really get that with Jews, however, or Israel for that matter as well. There are different sects of Judaism, but culturally they do end up being similar enough that they don't conflict with each other and they can actually mesh. So they get kind of like a national or a cultural land claim to Israel for that reason, although that wouldn't apply to Islam or Christianity, because those groups actually have a decent amount of cultural differences from nation to nation and group of people to group of people. But with that, hope that does address that well. And let's see. The chat has pretty much went into a conversation on this entirely. If y'all would like, we can ask some questions and talk about Ukraine a little bit, just to make sure to cover that again if y'all want. But let's see. And let's see. I'm glad I don't see any crazy chats anymore. If you don't like the show all button in the chat menu, it filters all the crazies out. I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting to hear. But let's see. Harvey the Drummer just threw in an $86 donation to the fundraiser, getting it up to $5.8 thousand nearly, just $9 short. Very nice though, and very cool. And let's see. And Butchie 777 said, "I'm going in for a dart." I know the Israeli thing is a pretty difficult one, but still. Tank 2 said, "Do you think that it would be a good move for a young man to go to Russia after the war, knowing there's a shortage of men and an overabundance of women?" Usually I don't really argue for people to go to places just because there's a large amount of women. Like there's like, I believe in, the right woman for the right guy kind of thing, I don't really believe it's just people showing up somewhere because there's a lack of men. But if someone wanted to do that, I mean, sure, I guess that would be a great thing to do. But I always just believe no matter if there's a overabundance of men compared to women or vice versa, you'll find the right person for you, regardless of the odds or the numbers or anything like that. But, if you're looking at it that way, yeah, I guess so. But anyways, let's see here. Let's see. And where is the fundraiser total in the chat? Sadly, I hate to tell you this, Seahorse Wrangler. YouTube is really finicky with how they put it in the chat. And so they ended up not putting it in the chat tonight. You can find it below the stream. It's like a little box on desktop in the bottom right corner of your screen, like you'll see right here. And it has about 34 minutes left on the fundraiser. But sadly, they didn't put it in the chat tonight. So that's why you're not seeing it in the live chat. Von Delta said, "Why is the U.S. and NATO piecemeal providing weapons and not providing enough for Ukraine to win?" It's a very complicated answer because it's actually different from country to country. Some European countries are counting on the United States to provide massive amounts of support to Ukraine, although they are still providing considerable support themselves. But then in the United States, it's getting tied into domestic issues, which is really murkying the waters and making it a lot more of a political question, which then I can't really answer. But it is different nation to nation, and nobody's really trying to piecemeal it. It's just that, sadly, it kind of does end up being piecemealed on occasion, and that's certainly one of those instances right now. And so with that, hope that does address that well. And Axel K threw in a question saying, "Can Zelenskyy do anything in Congress on his visit to get the aid moving?" I mean, maybe. I could say he could probably give another speech to Congress. Maybe he could talk to some of the opposing congressional members and try and change their minds. There's a lot that he could try and do, but most of it involves some great deals of grace and also trying to just persuade people that Ukraine is the right cause to support. And I don't really think it takes a lot to encourage people to support Ukraine. Zelenskyy doesn't even have to talk about the benefits that Ukraine will give America. He can just talk about the benefits the U.S. government or these congressional representatives are going to be giving to their constituents. The amount of U.S. support we've given to Ukraine, actually most of it gets spent here in America, nearly 90% of it. And it ends up creating a massive amount of jobs, very well-paying jobs, and sometimes in areas where some of the congressional representatives actually don't support Ukraine and are kind of going against their constituents' wishes. And if it's argued that way, I think a lot of people start to see that while they may not support the merits of backing Ukraine, it does bring a lot of benefit to their constituents within their districts, and therefore it may be pertinent to support Ukraine just for the reason of creating jobs and bolstering their local economy. That's a good way to argue it if you didn't want to argue it on Ukrainian merits alone. But with that, I hope that does address that well. And Randy Tolsto threw in a 50 to the fundraiser, getting it up to $5,841. We are so close to 6,000. Really impressive, considering that that would be twice the goal that we put out tonight. Let's see. And also, Walter A. Lakota came in again with another Oahu fact. Thank you so much. And let me get back to Oahu. And you said that the radar site has been replaced with a wind farm. And we can see that right there. That's so sad. I mean, that's really sad. And also really cool to hear that it's also a rifle range, though. That's really neat. But I hate to hear that it got turned into a wind farm. I feel like that was a historical site, and it should have been, at least the radar installation, should have been preserved in some form for future generations to be able to see. So that way when they go to Hawaii, they can hear about the whole story of Pearl Harbor, from the radar station picking up the incoming first wave and multiple waves that came after that, and then go down to Pearl Harbor itself and actually get to see Ford Island and all the memorials that stand for the ships that were lost. But still, thank you for sharing that. Really interesting. And also, S House and Trees said, great show tonight, and thank you for enjoying it. I've tried my best to make it as interesting as possible, even just running it myself. And I thank all of y'all so much for enjoying the stream and having some very kind words to say about it. It means a great deal to me. Of course, I started off solo, and it's always a little bit odd to go back to being solo, but I thank y'all all so much for enjoying it. And let's see here. Meeting, we can't answer that. I was about to read that. Oh, you almost got me there, David. But anyways, let's see. Some areas of Russia is offering a monetary reward for men going to go to Russia if you marry a Russian woman. LOL. What? Conscription? Oh, dang it. It moved me from the chat. I'm so sorry. I was about to read the whole thing and answer it, but it moved me from the chat. So I can't even find it because the chat's moved on so much since then. But let's see here. Have you heard anything about Viktor Orban coming to America? Do you know what all this is about? Interesting question, Renee. I actually haven't heard about that. I'd have to declare ignorance on that at the moment, because I didn't know that Viktor Orban would be coming to America, and I don't know what he would be coming for. Maybe just a diplomatic visit, just to have one, but still very interesting. I'll look into that a little bit more and see if I can grab some information on it to be able to explain it here when we come back on Tuesday. But let's see here. Jose Diaz said, we enjoy LSA chat. And I thank you so much for that. I enjoyed a great deal. And I got to say, it's been a very interesting conversation tonight. In between, and not just on Ukraine, but also on Israel as well. It's actually been quite an interesting one with how people look at things and talk about things and stuff. It's very insightful. But let's see here. Let's see. Panama Floyd said, "You done good, but give your bro a fist bump for the work he does here now that the place is so busy." Oh, I do. I give him a fist bump every once in a while. And I always make sure to thank him for what he does and, everything like that. But on nights like these, I just got to thank all of y'all for enjoying that it's just me that's running it, because it is a little difficult because I can't run polls or be as interactive with the live chat. But I still greatly appreciate all of y'all enjoying it, although Matthew's not here. But I'm sure many of y'all will be happy for when he comes back. But let's see here. And also, I see a lot of people trying to bring religion into the thing because we were talking about Islam versus Judaism and who has a claim to the land of Israel. Sadly, I don't get into religion on here. I'll have y'all know, full disclaimer, I am a Christian. that is what I am, you know, and if you have a problem with that, whoops, sorry, you know, I can't change me, but I don't like people to get into religious arguments because that usually just devolves into the Christians attacking the Muslims and the Jews, or the Muslims attacking the Christians and the Jews, or the Jews attacking the Muslims and the Christians, and then the atheists coming in and acting like they're superior than everyone because, you know, for reasons. It never ends up well because nobody ever changes their mind on that stuff, and it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really do anything to argue about it because all you're doing is creating more fights that don't end up producing anything. So I would love to ask if we could all just, you know, veer away from the political discussions because, you know, it ends up just causing endless fights and it doesn't really produce anything meaningful. But with that, moving on from that, we could see Anonymous said, you missed Alan Beckett's 50. Did I? Let me go check. Oh, crap. I thank you, Alan Beckett, for the 50. You threw in a 50, and it got us up to 5.916. We're getting very close to $6,000. We're about $84 away, I think. And so, thank you for that. And also, Paul Ranget said, I'd love to offer my X95 to your FFL to do a review on. And I thank you for that. I do have a connection that's an FFL, and we'll be getting a lot of machine guns to review thanks to his efforts. And of course, you know, we'll be making sure to follow all applicable laws and stuff like that when we do it. So he'll actually have to accompany us to the range and everything when we do that. But still, I would be more than happy to review an X95-4. That would be great. Just make sure if y'all have any offers like that, send it to us over Twitter, so that way we can make sure to follow through on that a little bit later and get your gun down here to review. But let's see. Moving on from that, Walter A. Lakota said, look up the 25th Light Infantry patch. Shaped like a taro leaf, which is native to Hawaii. Let's pull that up. 25th Light Infantry Division. Oh, isn't that neat? I've never seen this division emblem before, but I liked that one. Really cool, and thank you for sharing that, Walter. I don't know what a taro leaf looks like, but I'm going to trust you. It probably does look a lot like a taro leaf. But still, that is a really cool little patch right there. And I got to thank you for sharing that. And so with that, moving on from that one and into our next one, we can see that, let's see, you're doing Siri said you're doing a good job. And thank you, Siri, so much for enjoying the work. And let's see here. Captain Wallers said how? I would have to find out. So if you want, just DM us over Twitter, and I'm going to talk to our guy who runs the store that is offering to help us out with doing gun reviews, and I'll ask him if it's possible for us to do that, because I don't know if you know, transferring a rifle to him and then loaning it to me so that way he could shoot it, I don't know how that works, so I'd have to check into it first to see if that's even allowable, because if it's not, we might have to end up traveling to wherever y'all are to then review them and figure out how that's going to work. Captain Walrus said, how about a review on an RPG? That would be an interesting one. I don't really know how difficult it would be to get an RPG 7-round, because there's a lot of paperwork that goes into destructive devices. You know, even if we're loaning it, there would be a lot of paperwork to that. But I would have to see if we could try that, because that would be pretty cool to do. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. Very cool question, though. And let's see. Here. What else do we have? Let's see. Looking for more questions. Oh, dang! Davis Campbell put in an 84 Canadian dollar donation, finally taking us to $5,978. We are literally like $32 away from reaching the $6,000 mark. Look at that. Isn't that cool? And thank you so much for that. And let's see. Certain Def said, Mitchell and daughter shot like 30 different guns in a minute. All weapons were benched ready. Interesting. I think I saw that video at some point. And also, we just hit, oh, wait a minute. Oh, man. Tom Exman, nope, we're $2 short. It's $5,998. We're only $2 away. A $2 donation could be the one that sends us over the top to $6,000. But sadly, we haven't hit $6,000 yet. We're just $2 away. But let's see here. RPG-7 almost killed him. Oh, well, dude, Backblast. Whew. Yeah, Backblast is nasty on those things. And let's see, Avari Mandabrata said, have you been keeping up with the Myanmar Civil War? And we just hit 6,000! Let's go! Harvey the drummer threw in a $32 donation to the fundraiser and got us up to $6,030 raised. damn, I gotta say, amazing. And it's crazy because it's $6,000 raised. That's a massive amount. Twice the fundraiser goal, and incredible to know the Least Spring Army is still kicking strong, even this late in the war. But let's see here. Elazar said, how much do you think the U.S. invests, why do you think the U.S. invests so much into Israel? Oh, well, I would love to answer that. Sadly, that's a political answer because we would have to get into domestic politics for some reason, I don't even know why, it's very rooted in domestic politics and it's not really about international diplomacy or anything like that. So sadly, I can't answer that. But we'll try and get around to that sometime in the future, but probably not soon. It'd probably be the years down the road. But with that, let's see. Oh, Christian Cruz said, what about testing a Carl Gustav AT? And that's a really interesting idea. If we could end up getting our hands on some destructive devices to test out and film, that would be very cool. Because I think technically all of those are classified as not machine guns, or well, they are class 3, but they're not machine guns, they're destructive devices. So I would have to see if we could get our hands on one of those. Hopefully we would, because that would be cool to get the Carl Gustav and hear that ping. But I don't know where we would do that. We'd probably have to get in contact with the U.S. Army to do something like that. Because, you know, maybe they have some, and maybe they'd be really willing to bring us onto a range of Fort Benning and let us try out a Carl Gustav or something. Who knows? But maybe one day. And Tim Cavazzo said, I'm late. What happened to Matt? Oh, Matt's just not here tonight. He wasn't able to be here. He's actually out of town right now. He's somewhere else entirely. But he will be back in time for the stream on Tuesday. Ethan, the Japanese-American Sylveon, said, the Enforcer, is it possible for Ukraine and Russia to make peace if they didn't go into a conflict? Certainly. There certainly was a chance. But the Russians decided not to take it because it was all or nothing for them, and so they ended up invading Ukraine. But they could have done that entirely. Panama Floyd said, Enforcer, I'm looking forward to the gun test videos, but I'm a bit worried. Most of my interest is in antique weapons. How is it determined whether or not they are safe to fire? Well, usually, Panama Floyd, if I get an antique gun, I usually just get a bullet for the thing, put it in, and then fire it. And I find out if it's safe or not that way. So far, all of them have been safe, and I haven't gotten shrapnel in the face. But that's usually how I figure out if they're safe to fire or not, is I just shoot them and find out. It's not really the safest way to test them, sure, but it's the way I test them, and it's worked well for me. So with that, I hope that does address that well. And, let's see here. Looking around. Also, by the way, to share something, I do have a Brown Bess. That was actually the first gun I ever got. It was a Brown Bess long pattern. I believe it was a second pattern long Bess reproduction, and that was the first one I got. I got that before I even turned 18. Because they're, you know, technically not considered firearms, so anyone can own one. But it's really cool. I've used it at reenactments. Really neat little musket, but not really used a lot anymore because I don't get to do a lot of reenacting. And let's see here. What else do I have that's ancient? I have a Vetterli rifle from Switzerland from like the 1870s. Got that thing in a steel. That's the one I'm the most proud of because they go for about $600 to $700 online, and I was able to pick mine up in pretty good condition for about $180. So very proud of that. That's one of the best acquisitions I've ever gotten, and it's a beautiful piece. The Vetterli rifles were just gorgeous looking, not really that great, and they were very archaic by the time of the First World War, and they were still being used in World War I, although the bolt action system on that thing is archaic as hell, and I don't even know how in the world it actually really works. But let's see here. Moving on to the next one. Panama Boy said, don't pick up a spiral wound musket. I probably won't. But let's see here. Let's see. GW North said, I carried a Brown Bess in the cadets when I was 14. You can't move your left hand after a parade. Oh, dude, the Brown Bess is so heavy. It's so long, too. Like, it's insanely long. The thing's, I think, like, at least a little bit short of 5 feet. And Hoodoo, Texas, of course, has a Vetterli. Dude, they're great, though. I mean, like, you can't find the ammo for them. The ammo's obsolete. It shoots a 10.4 millimeter cartridge that was a, I think it was a rimmed cartridge. They don't even make them anymore, and I've never seen one. But if we could find the ammo for it, I'd shoot it. And so TT asked, do you think it's possible that the Kremlin wall was behind dragging an anchor through the Baltic connector pipeline and planting the anchor that was found in the Gulf of Finland to frame China? No, I think it may have just been Chinese negligence. And I don't think it was a deliberate thing, actually. I think it was just some idiot, Chinese vessel weighed anchor because it couldn't get into the harbor out in that area, and it just ended up cutting the pipeline. Maybe that's what happened, or maybe it was deliberate, but I have a feeling that the Russians weren't really involved. I have a feeling, if anything, it was entirely either because of Chinese negligence or Chinese, an actual deliberate Chinese action. And so with that, I hope that does address that well, at least in my opinion, and I could be wrong. And Captain Walrus said, I want a review on grenade launchers. Okay, so we do have one that we can do, but it's not going to be with an actual grenade. It's going to be a dud grenade because we have to, keep everything completely illegal because I don't want to get in trouble with the ATF. But we do have a KBKG WZ-60, which is a Polish variant of the AK, which was purpose-made to fire anti-tank rifle grenades. And so we do have one of those that we are going to be able to review. It's really cool, and I do have a dud round on the way, so it should be here soon. And we're planning on trying to review that before the next semester starts. We are going to film maybe about 3 or 4 different videos on different rifles, and hopefully that's all going to work. And Jay Bagwell said, blunderbuss. Oh, that would be cool. I have not ever seen a blunderbuss. I've only seen them in pictures, but if I can get my hands on one of those, oh, you bet, we're doing a review on a blunderbuss. That would be cool. And Bootlegger has a Sharps pepper box. That's cool. That's cool. I'm jealous. I'm jealous. I'm not gonna lie. That's really cool. Let's see. Let's see here. Christian Cruz says, I'm looking for my next. I got a Remington 110 Tech 4 and 308 Accuracy International and an AK. What should I get next? I would have to ask Christian, what kind of AK is it? Is it like a Century Arms AK or is it like a legit AK? Because I've started to really get into AK, like the AK world in America in the collector's field, and there's actually real AKs you can get. You can get Bulgarian AKs. That's a really common one. It was almost built as a carbon copy of the Soviet pattern of AK-74, so it's the closest you'll get to having a real Soviet AK-74. But let me know what kind, and if it's a real, like, Warsaw packed kind of an AK, then I'll tell you that you're set, and I would tell you to probably get like a replica M16 because they're really cool too. But it's really up to you. And let's see. Moving on to the next one. The Enforcer, Hoodoo Texas said, the Enforcer, the Veterli could be modified to fire centerfire cartridges. They made the rimfire ammo up to about World War II. It was very popular in Appalachia, called the poor man's bear rifle. And I thank you for sharing that. I've heard that it can be converted to fire centerfire, but I also heard that it was very expensive. And considering I kind of got it as a wall piece, I was like, I don't think I'll convert it to centerfire. And let's see. Moving on from that. And also, I love to hear that all of y'all are very big into hearing about the gun reviews. I can't wait to do them either. And Captain Walrus, I can't wait either. We're really wanting to get going on this thing. But let's see here. Moving on from that, Sea Dog Pirate said, would you get a Kentucky rifle to review? You can get them as building kits. I know a guy who has them just on the wall. They can be sold, but they're so expensive. Like a Kentucky rifle is like $1,100 from what I saw, completely made and built and everything. And I was just like, dang, that is expensive. Because to put it in context, I can find M1 Garands out there for about $750, which is still pretty expensive, but that's, worthwhile because an M1 Garand would be a very cool rifle to review. But $1,100 for a muzzle-loading flintlock rifle, that would be a pretty expensive expenditure. And one that would probably not be that good on a video, because a lot of people want to see machine guns and modern rifles in videos, and not a lot of people are into muzzle-loading or black powder guns on YouTube. So we probably, like the muzzleloader, like all of y'all have probably heard of the muzzleloader if you're into like gun channels. He was able to make a channel on it, but not a lot of people can. And so we want to kind of like be in the area of the turn of the century or modern era guns. That's kind of the realm that we're going to be in. But let's see. Let's see here. What else? J Bagel said, tonight reminds me these rabbit holes are what hooked me into the channel. Smiley face. Thank you so much for it. Usually I have to curtail rabbit holes because you know, there's a lot of constraints to what I can do on air most of the time for reasons, but I do thank you so much for enjoying them because I love rabbit holes. You know, that's a big thing I do, and thank you, Jay, for enjoying it. And let's see, TT, you are doing a great job soloing tonight. Hope you and Matt get to catch up on sleep now that you're on holidays. Oh, I wish we would. I wish we would, but I can't. I can't do it too much. I got to make sure I'm sleep deprived because that's how I work at my finest. So thank you so much for the well wishes. But I'm an idiot, so I'm going to make sure to be as unhealthy about sleeping as possible. And let's see. Someone said semi-auto owners have to register their firearms with the state. I haven't heard about that here. Let me go pull that up. Do you have to register for semi-autos? Let's see here. Machine gun, let's see here. The right licensing, perfectly legal to own. Well, we're not looking for that. I can't see anything, sadly, Paul, about that happening in the state of Alabama. So I would have to be honest with you. Yes, you should. I would never encourage anyone to break the law because, you know, not only will that get you into trouble, that could also get me into trouble. So I would not encourage you to break the law. If your state requires that you register your semi-automatic with the state government, I would go through with that. But that is really weird that the state government will want you to register it with them because your semi-automatics are already registered with the ATF when you filed your Form 4473 to be able to purchase your firearm. So a little bit odd that your state would want you to do that, but if they do, I would highly encourage you not to break the law because it could end up being a felony charge if you were found to have not registered your semi-automatic. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. And let's see. Avari Mendebratis said, I would love to see U.S. World War II weapons, the M1 Garand, the carbine, the grease gun, the BAR, etc. Also, Myanmar? And also, sadly, we can't cover Myanmar. We are very stretched for time as it is with the Ukraine and Israel news segments. But we are going to be able to review a lot of World War II era guns. Me, personally, I have been able to find an M1 Garand. I've also been able to find a carbine. And, of course, at, like, rock bottom prices, which is very good because, you know, it's making it possible for me to ever even get them. But I was able to find those. Do not have a grease gun because I think grease guns are like $30,000 and that would be impossible for me to be able to get. The BAR is like $50,000, also impossible for me to get. On top of that, it would take a tax stamp in like 8 months. So we're going to get those as loaners from other folks. And so really all I have is a Garand and a carbine, and I was very lucky to get them because the guy who originally owned them passed away, and his wife was willing to just get rid of them because she just didn't really care about them. So I ended up being able to get them at a significantly cheaper price than what the collector's price really is for them. So that was very fortunate. And I have to give a credit to the man who passed away. He kept very good care of his rifles. They are in mint condition, and so I was very happy to see them. And I've been making sure to try and keep as great of care as possible on them as well, to make sure that they will survive through my hands and go on to the next generation. So that way, they too will be able to see historic weapons from World War II, because it's very cool. It's incredibly neat. And let's see. And Hoodoo Texas says New Illinois law. Oh. Hate to hear that. Probably has to do, if I had to guess, because I don't really know a lot about that law and I haven't really heard about it much, because I try and avoid, you know, everything domestically in the United States, probably has something to do with Chicago, if I had to take a guess, because crime rates are very high there. But beyond that, I hate to hear that, but I would make sure to register your semi-auto. Or, you know, you could move to another state. You know, if you don't want to register them, you could always just move to another state with the intent to permanently reside there, become domiciled in that other state. You're now a citizen, not of Illinois, you're a citizen of another state, and you don't have to register your semi-autos. But considering that you only have about 20 days to sell your house and move, probably would be an unrealistic option. And also, you know, who knows? There's a lot of other factors as well. Walter A. Lakota said, I have a German Nazi World War II bayonet at home. That is really cool. That is really neat. I'm a huge fan of bayonets. I think they're cool, little extra piece for the rifles. And it's really cool to know you have one of those. Really neat. Let's see. And also, sadly, I can't address that one, Christopher, but a very interesting point. But let's see here. Let's see. And someone said, the source. Okay, this is something I'm actually going to get a little bit miffed at because this is aggravating to me. Someone said the Murnatav Stele is a forgery or a translation error. I think you may want to look into your sources because Wikipedia isn't a credible source. So I'm guessing that the National Museum of Egypt is just stupid and they're putting something on display that isn't even a historical object. Is that what you're telling me? That's like saying, you know, the actually the Stonehenge is fake. That's like saying that. Or, you know, the Great Pyramids are actually a forgery. The Egyptians never built those things. The aliens did. That's about as asinine as saying that. Or that's about as asinine as saying the Gutenberg Bible is fake and it was printed on a laser jet in the 90s. Gotta tell you, man, you're kind of drinking Kool-Aid there to say that something that has been verified well enough to be in the National Museum of Egypt is a forgery. That's a little crazy to me because I have worked in a museum before and I can tell you that even the one on my state level that I worked at was so damn severe about their checking and fact-checking and triple fact-checking on their items that they were putting on display that it's impossible to ever have a forgery or a fake put up. They have experts, collectors, they have people come in and they look at these things and they go, yes, that's authentic, or no, it's a fake. And so it would be pretty tough to forge an entire tablet from ancient Egypt and fool the Egyptians themselves into putting it in their national museum. So I hate to tell you that, man. I mean, if you want to, like, and I don't mean to put down your argument because I always want to be polite about it, but that's pretty much sipping Kool-Aid right there, man. So, you know, I hate to tell you that, but anyways, also Panama Floyd, that's the same argument. The Rosetta Stone would be fake if that's fake. Hell, who the hell knows? I mean, hell, maybe Napoleon himself just went into Egypt and they had the French bring the Rosetta Stone back to France so that way they could just fake the entire, Egyptian hieroglyphical language system so that way they could make hieroglyphics say whatever they wanted to for French propaganda. Why not argue that as well? Because that's about as similar an argument as that. So let's see. Kevin Cookie said, don't go down that wormhole. Oh, no, we're not. Like, that one's just insane. I don't mean to be rude about it, but that is just ridiculous. Anyways, let's see here. And also, like, on top of that, it's ridiculous because Egypt is a strictly Islamic nation. I mean, it's not Islamic like Sharia law in Saudi Arabia or anything, but it's somewhat close. And it would be pretty crazy for them to put a forgery of a tablet in their museum, which recognizes that the Kingdom of Israel existed 1700 years before Islam existed. How in the world would that thing have survived, like a fossil? How in the world would that thing have survived anyone? Nasser, for that matter. That wouldn't have survived Nasser's reign. He would have had it destroyed. So, you know, if it was a forgery, it wouldn't be around. Yeah, I can promise you that. So that's just crazy. But anyways, let's see. Have a guy they can call to come down and take a look. Yeah, that's true. They always do. They always have a guy who can do that. They always know some guy. Like, you could bring in a button and say that this button is from a uniform in the Civil War. They will call up a guy who somehow is an expert on buttons from the U.S. Civil War, and he will come to that museum and he will tell you whether it's a real button or not, and he'll know exactly what he's looking for. So, you know, that's something that they have, and that's why it's impossible to have a forgery in a museum. And if it happens, it's like a 1 in a million thing, especially when that thing has been on exhibit for, say, several decades. People have gone through and studied that thing to make sure it's authentic. So I hope that does address that well. Good point too. I think it's in British Museum. No, sadly, Tom, it's not. That is one of the few things that isn't in the British Museum. And let me go back and get this little thing. Let me go over here real quick and look through that. There we go. The Murnatav Stele. Here we go. This thing, as the picture states, well, actually, sorry. Let's see. It's an inscription placed in ancient Egypt, discovered by Flinders Petrie at Thebes in 1896. It is now housed at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So it's in Cairo. It's not in the British Museum, but the British Museum is a great place to go to see some ancient artifacts. Very interesting museum. I've been there in person a few years ago. Really cool. I mean, you see things that nobody ever sees, like the Cyrus cylinders in the British Museum. Really cool stuff. But let's see here. And also, Tom Axel said they carbon date the age items. Yeah, they do. That's another thing where it'd be like, yeah, it's kind of tough to forge this thing. And also, if we look at this guy here, I'm sure if we look at this guy's life, this guy is going to be a pretty big guy in the archaeological world. So let's check. British Egyptologist and a pioneer of systematic methodology in archaeology and the preservation of artifacts. He held the first chair of Egyptology in the United Kingdom and excavated many of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt, in conjunction with his wife, Hilda Erlin, pictured there. Some consider his most famous discovery to be that of the Mernatef stele, an opinion with which Petrie himself concurred. Undoubtedly, at least as important as his 1905 discovery and correct identification of the character of the Proto-Sinaitic script, the ancestor of almost all alphabetic scripts. Petrie developed the system of dating layers based on pottery and ceramic findings. Today, he's denounced for his pro-eugenics views. He was a dedicated believer in the superiority of the northern peoples over the Latinate and southern peoples. So, the guy's got some pretty wild views, that I think we can all admit that, but still, the guy is a pretty accomplished guy, at least in the realm of Egyptology. And as far as it goes, by a historical standard, the British are the ones to look to for Egyptology, even above the Egyptians themselves. During the Victorian era, when this guy was an archaeologist and an Egyptologist, Britain had a fascination with the culture and history of Egypt, and also that of the Arab world for the most part, and the Ottomans, to an unbelievable degree. It was a bit of a craze. And so they ended up having some of the most noted and well-researched Egyptologists the world over, and they largely were the ones who wrote the books on Egypt's ancient history in the modern day. So, pretty interesting stuff. The guy's got some questionable views, but I don't think it should, just completely condemn everything he did for the world of Egyptology. The guy was a little wild, but at the same time, he did a lot to progress the understanding of ancient Egypt history. But still, pretty interesting stuff. And let's see here. Early life. He was the son of William Petrie and was the daughter of British Captain Matthew Flinders, who led the first circumnavigation of Australia, and he was named after that. Williams Petrie was an electrical engineer who developed a carbon arc lighting and later developed chemical processes for Johnson, Matthey and Company. Petrie was raised in a Christian household and was educated at home. He had no formal education. So really quickly, because I was having a feeling, and I had to make sure to read about his upbringing. I was having a feeling, because this is something that if you ever are on the internet, you will always see, is that they'll be like, it's a forgery because the guy who discovered the tablet was actually a Jew himself, and therefore he just came up with it out of thin air. That's not true, because this guy was actually raised in a Christian household, so especially by the religious standards of the time, and this guy clearly having some very interesting racial views, as we could see, he has really no incentive to actually find a tablet like the Mernatef stele that would have given legitimacy to the Kingdom of Israel and the Jewish people. But nevertheless, he did find it, although his personal views, would have clearly led him, if he was, guided by bias, to make sure that this tablet never existed. So there we have it. A third party that is actually biased in the opposite to what he found the tablet, and therefore it adds a lot more credibility to this tablet being a very legitimate one, and also a real one as well. With that, hope that does address that well, and of course people are laughing about the use of Wikipedia. Hey, what am I supposed to do? Read like 5 books in like 5 minutes? I can't do that. So we have to use Wikipedia as kind of like a quick source. But largely Wikipedia is mostly accurate with what they put down. And also Angry Penguin said he seems like the last guy who would have brought it to light. Yeah, like that's the interesting thing about back then, is that usually people, even though like this guy, we can clearly tell this guy was a pretty avid racist here. And obviously wouldn't have liked anyone from the Arabic world or even the Jewish people for that matter. The guy ended up finding a tablet and also being big into Egyptology to the point that it didn't matter whether it agreed or disagreed with his views. He just discovered things and would publish it or, something similar. So that adds a lot of credibility. This guy obviously wouldn't have wanted something like this to be out there, but he found it, he discovered it, he published it. He also, sent it off somewhere. I'm assuming since he's British, it would have been sent to the British Museum first, and then probably back to Cairo at some later point in history. But he found it, and there would be no reason for him to come up with a forgery. So that, hope that does address that well, because we finally got down to the bottom of that. And also, believe it or not, I said I was going to address questions for the next 30 minutes. I've been addressing questions for the next hour. It's been an entire hour, and time has really flown. And so, with that, I hope that does address that well as kind of our last thing to cover for the night. And I got to thank all of y'all so much once again for watching. If y'all have enjoyed, please do make sure to hit the like button, make sure to subscribe, and make sure to share this channel with your friends and family because it makes me greatly appreciative. And also makes Matthew, although he's not here tonight, greatly appreciative to know that so many of y'all have enjoyed this channel, to be able to hit the like button and to be able to share this thing around. I hope we see you all again on Tuesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time this next week, because we will be making sure to cover the next 48 hours of the news of the war in Ukraine and also the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. I have to thank you all so much once again as well for making sure to raise $6,035 on the fundraiser. The fundraiser just officially closed out, and it reached a grand total of $6,035, an unbelievable sum. An unbelievable thing to think as well, that so many of y'all have such a large heart and such great compassion for the people of Ukraine, even during the Christmas times when many of y'all are most likely, strained on budget, getting people Christmas gifts. I'll admit I'm one of those people as well, and making sure to take care of Ukraine still. Y'all's hearts are made of gold, and the generosity of y'all as the Elite Spring Army, it truly knows no bounds, and it blows me away that tonight we were able to see that the fundraiser goal was surpassed by a factor of 2, and truly showing that the Elite Spring Army will go down in history, on internet history at least, as being one of the kindest and most generous communities that would have ever existed on the face of this platform. I've got to thank you all so much once again, not just for being here, but for being who y'all are. Y'all are very unique, very special, and some of the kindest people I've seen out there. I would also like to thank everyone who kept it incredibly civil tonight, even when we were entering some very controversial topics in the waters. We rarely ever do that on this channel, and I've got to say, it's something interesting to note. And I've got to thank every single one of y'all, not just for the content of y'all's characters and making sure to take care of people thousands of miles away that some of y'all may have not even met, but to also make sure to be civil to each other and understand that while differences of opinions may exist on topics like Israel, it doesn't mean that it has to go to blows. That was incredibly commendable of all of y'all, and I've got to thank y'all for keeping that civil. And so with that, good night, good luck, take care, stay safe, long live the Elite Spring Army, Slava Ukraini, Slava the United States, and Slava Israel. And good night, and take care.
Yes.
The Elite Spring Army sends its regards.
Русский военный корабль. Предлагаю сложить оружие и сдаться. Русский военный корабль, иди нахуй.